For much of the 20th century, Vietnam was caught in the grip of war. A war not just of armies and ideologies, but of survival, identity, and independence. From the shadows of colonial rule to the firestorms of aerial bombardment, Vietnam became the setting for one of the most devastating conflicts of modern history, a war that reshaped global politics and left scars that remain even today. Tonight, we go deep into this story, not just to recount the battles, but to understand the weight of history, the loss of innocence. If you enjoy listening to these sleep time history narrations, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a story that brings the past to life while you drift off to sleep. And before you settle in, let us know in the comments, where are you listening from and what time is it? It's always fascinating to see how far history reaches across the world. Vietnam's struggle did not begin with the arrival of American forces, nor with the rise of communism. Its roots stretched back decades earlier, deep into the colonial ambitions of European empires. In the late 19th century, France tightened its grip on Indochina, turning Vietnam into a colonial possession, its lands exploited, its people forced into servitude beneath foreign rule. The French saw Vietnam as an economic asset, draining its resources to feed their industries, treating its population as little more than laborers bound by imperial decree. Rice, rubber, and minerals flowed out of Vietnam to enrich France, while the native people suffered under staggering taxes, forced labor, and the systematic dismantling of their cultural and political autonomy. Schools taught children in French, erasing Vietnamese identity, while bureaucratic structures ensured that no native citizen could rise to power without loyalty to the colonial masters. Resistance simmered beneath the surface, but the French were merciless. Dissent was crushed with arrests, executions, and forced exile. For decades, Vietnam existed as a land occupied, drained, reshaped to serve a power far removed from its shores. But even in the deepest shadows of colonization, voices whispered of defiance, of sovereignty, of reclaiming the nation that had been stolen from them. Among those voices was a young revolutionary, one who would become the defining symbol of Vietnamese independence, Ho Chi Minh. He was not born into power, nor raised in privilege, but he possessed a vision, a relentless determination to free his homeland. His journey began far from the jungles of Vietnam, across borders and continents, from Paris to Moscow to China, where he studied, learned, and prepared for the day when his people could finally rise. In the coming years, his name would echo across battlefields and diplomatic halls alike, a force that no empire, not French, not Japanese, not American, could ignore. Ho Chi Minh was not just a revolutionary. He was the embodiment of Vietnam's struggle against foreign domination. A man who had spent his life studying movements of liberation across the world, from socialist uprisings in Europe to nationalist revolts in Asia. He understood that Vietnam's independence could not be achieved through half measures, nor by seeking compromise with colonial rulers who had exploited his people for generations. From an early age, he saw the brutal realities of French occupation, Vietnamese workers toiling under unbearable conditions, local businesses crushed under colonial regulations, and his fellow citizens denied basic rights in their own homeland. He watched as resistance movements were swiftly suppressed, as leaders were imprisoned or executed, as any attempt to challenge French rule was met with violent retaliation, proving that Vietnam's freedom would not be handed over. It would have to be taken. Determined to fight for this cause, he traveled across the world, learning from Marxist revolutionaries in Moscow, nationalist movements in China, and labor organizations in Europe, absorbing the strategies of uprisings that had challenged imperial rule and reclaiming their nations. By the 1940s, Ho Chi Minh had organized and unified Vietnamese nationalist forces, building what would become the Viet Minh, a coalition of guerrilla fighters, intellectuals, and working class revolutionaries committed to breaking free from French control. And for a brief moment, it seemed as though his vision of independence was within reach. As World War II spread across the globe, Japan seized control of Vietnam, replacing the French colonial rulers with their own military occupation. Ho saw this as an opportunity, a moment where Vietnam's enemies were distracted, weakened, vulnerable, and he led a relentless campaign against Japanese forces, coordinating attacks, assassinations, and sabotage missions that weakened their hold on the region. When Japan surrendered in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, a free republic no longer bound to any foreign empire. In a powerful speech before thousands of Vietnamese citizens, he quoted the American Declaration of Independence, believing that the principles the United States had fought for, freedom, democracy, the right of self-governance, should also apply to Vietnam. But what Ho did not yet realize was that the world was not ready to let Vietnam go. Despite America's rhetoric about self-determination and decolonization, the US made a crucial decision that would shape the next decades of Vietnam's fate, to support France in reclaiming its lost colony. The reason? Cold War politics, alliances, and a deep fear of communist influence spreading across Southeast Asia. The war Ho Chi Minh had envisioned, the war against colonial occupation, was about to transform into something far more complex, far more devastating. US support for France post-WWI, despite anti-colonial rhetoric, was now Vietnam's new reality, and Ho Chi Minh's fight was far from over. In the aftermath of World War II, Vietnam stood at a crossroads. The Japanese occupation had collapsed, and Ho Chi Minh had declared independence, citing the very principles of self-determination that had shaped revolutions across history. His words echoed the ideals of democracy and freedom, but they fell on deaf ears. The United States, despite its outward stance against colonial rule, made a decision that would change the fate of Vietnam forever, to back France in reclaiming its lost territory. For Ho Chi Minh, this was a devastating blow. He had once reached out to America, hoping that President Truman would recognize Vietnam's fight for sovereignty, that the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence. Those same principles he had quoted when announcing Vietnam's liberation would resonate in Washington. But the Cold War had shifted the world's priorities, and Vietnam's independence was no longer just a question of colonialism. It was a question of ideology. The post-war world was divided into two camps: the democratic West, led by the United States, and the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union. Every nation's future was viewed not through the lens of its own identity, but through the lens of global influence. Vietnam, under Ho Chi Minh's leadership, had embraced communist ideals, not out of loyalty to Moscow, but because communism offered a path to nationalism, self-sufficiency, and independence from Western imperialism. To the United States, however, communism was the ultimate threat. The Truman Doctrine, issued in 1947, formalized America's commitment to stopping its spread, declaring that nations falling under communist rule posed a danger to democracy everywhere. It was no longer just about Vietnam. It was about stopping a ripple effect, ensuring that Southeast Asia did not become another front in the Cold War. Thus, despite its long-standing rhetoric against colonial rule, the United States funneled money, weapons, and military support to France, helping its former ally wage war against Vietnamese nationalists. The goal was clear: not to restore French imperialism, but to prevent Vietnam from falling into communist hands. And as the conflict escalated, a new theory emerged. One that would shape American intervention in Vietnam for decades to come: the domino theory. Cold War paranoia was now fully at play, and Vietnam had become the battleground for a much larger war. One that was not just about its own future, but about the future of an entire region. Truman feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow, spreading Soviet influence across the Pacific, threatening US allies, and shifting the balance of global power. The domino theory and Cold War paranoia. The Truman Doctrine had set the stage, and now Vietnam was no longer fighting for independence alone. It was entangled in a battle far bigger than itself. In the tense, post-war global order, the United States saw communism not just as an ideology, but as an existential threat to democracy, capitalism, and Western dominance. The Truman Doctrine, established in 1947, made this clear: the US would actively intervene anywhere in the world where communism threatened to take root, even if it meant supporting oppressive regimes or former colonial powers. Vietnam, despite Ho Chi Minh's calls for independence, was now entangled in this doctrine, pulled into a war that was no longer about self-determination, but about stopping the spread of Soviet influence. America's leaders feared a chain reaction, a domino effect where communist control in one country would lead to the fall of its neighbors, triggering instability across entire regions. If Vietnam became communist, then Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, all could follow, strengthening Moscow's grip on global politics, potentially threatening US allies in the Pacific. This fear was not based on direct military assessments. It was based on paranoia, the belief that a single ideological shift in Southeast Asia could unravel the delicate balance the US was desperately trying to maintain against the Soviet Union. Thus, the US continued pouring resources into France's failing war effort, supplying money, weapons, and logistical support to keep Vietnam from slipping away. The irony was striking. America, which had once fought a revolution against colonial rule, was now backing France in its attempt to hold onto a colony it had brutally exploited for decades. The contradiction was glaring, but to American policymakers, the Cold War outweighed all other concerns. Containing communism was more important than honoring Vietnam's right to sovereignty, more important than acknowledging the hypocrisy of funding a colonial war under the banner of democracy. As French forces continued their struggle, America's involvement deepened, and a new president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, would take this commitment even further. Eisenhower and the domino theory would soon define US strategy, shaping not just Vietnam's fate, but America's long and bloody involvement in Southeast Asia. Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the White House in 1953 with the full weight of Cold War tensions on his shoulders, determined to keep communism from spreading further across the globe. His administration inherited Vietnam's growing conflict, and though the French were struggling to maintain control, Eisenhower saw no room for compromise. His foreign policy was guided by one belief: the domino theory, the idea that if one nation fell to communism, others would quickly follow. To him, Vietnam was not just one country in crisis. It was the first tile in a chain reaction that could engulf all of Southeast Asia, threatening the global balance of power. Eisenhower publicly warned of this danger, arguing that if Vietnam became a communist state, then Laos would fall, Cambodia would follow, and soon Thailand, Indonesia, and even the Philippines could be next. In his view, communism was not a series of isolated movements, but a calculated expansion by the Soviet Union and China, aiming to consume weaker nations, spreading instability throughout the region. Preventing Vietnam from turning red was not just a matter of supporting democracy. It was a matter of defending American influence on a global scale. But France was losing its grip. Despite years of brutal warfare, French forces could not defeat Ho Chi Minh's guerrilla fighters, who had mastered jungle warfare, sabotage tactics, and political mobilization, outmaneuvering traditional military strategies. The final blow came in 1954 at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnamese revolutionaries crushed French forces, bringing an end to France's colonial rule. Eisenhower now faced a dilemma. Should the US let Vietnam go, or should it step in directly? He chose intervention, but not through open military deployment, not yet. Instead, his administration turned to the one branch of the government that specialized in covert operations, sabotage, and manipulation: the CIA. And in the coming years, as Vietnam transitioned from colonial rule into civil conflict, the CIA's quiet operations in Southeast Asia would begin laying the foundation for America's deeper involvement in the war. As the French military crumbled in Vietnam, losing its colonial grip after the devastating defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the United States faced a critical decision: how to prevent Vietnam from falling completely into communist control. With Cold War tensions escalating, open military intervention was not yet an option. Instead, the US turned to its most discreet and effective weapon, the CIA. Over the next decade, the agency would play a hidden but crucial role in shaping Vietnam's political landscape, manipulating leadership, orchestrating covert operations, and laying the groundwork for deeper American involvement in the years ahead. The CIA's mission was clear: to keep Ho Chi Minh's influence in check, destabilizing communist factions while ensuring that a US-friendly government took hold in Vietnam. To achieve this, they targeted nationalist movements, influenced elections, and propped up leaders who opposed communism, even if those leaders were unpopular or corrupt. Propaganda flooded the streets, framing Ho Chi Minh's government as a Soviet puppet, warning Vietnamese citizens that falling under communist rule would lead to starvation, political purges, and the destruction of religious freedoms. Meanwhile, CIA operatives worked behind the scenes, funneling money to anti-communist groups, training South Vietnamese forces, and identifying key figures who could serve American interests. One of the CIA's most significant actions came in organizing mass relocations, encouraging over 1 million Catholic Vietnamese citizens to flee from the communist north into the south, reinforcing anti-communist sentiment and ensuring that Ho Chi Minh's government would be viewed as oppressive. The agency also sabotaged communist supply lines, secretly armed local militias, and played a key role in shaping South Vietnam's emerging leadership, ensuring that pro-US figures held power, even when the people did not truly support them. As these covert operations unfolded, the world's focus turned to Geneva, where diplomats gathered to determine Vietnam's future. The result was the 1954 Geneva Accords, an agreement that officially divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating two separate governments: the Communist North, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist South, backed by the West. The division was meant to be temporary, with national elections scheduled to unify the country. But behind closed doors, American officials had no intention of allowing those elections to happen, knowing that Ho Chi Minh would almost certainly win by overwhelming numbers. Instead, the US plotted to reinforce South Vietnam, ensuring that the nation remained divided, a betrayal that would sow the seeds for war. Dividing a nation, Geneva Accords and betrayals. The 1954 Geneva Accords marked the official division of Vietnam, but the promise of reunification would soon be shattered, leading the country down a path toward conflict that could no longer be avoided. The 1954 Geneva Accords were meant to be a turning point, an agreement that would stabilize Vietnam after nearly a century of colonial rule and years of brutal war against the French. The world's major powers gathered in Geneva, Switzerland, to negotiate peace, hoping to settle Vietnam's fate without another prolonged conflict. On paper, the accords were designed to prevent further bloodshed, granting Vietnam independence while temporarily dividing the country at the 17th parallel. The North would be controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist government, while the South would be governed separately under a USD-backed administration. But the key condition of the agreement was clear. The division was only meant to last until national elections were held in 1956, allowing the Vietnamese people to decide their own unified leadership. For Ho Chi Minh, this was a fair compromise. He had massive support among the Vietnamese population, particularly the working class peasants who had suffered the most under French rule. If elections were held, he was almost certain to win, bringing Vietnam under full independence with a government that was built from its own revolutionary movement. The problem: the United States had no intention of allowing those elections to happen. American officials quietly dismissed the Geneva Accords, knowing that a free vote would hand Vietnam over to communist control. Instead of honoring the agreement, the US took immediate steps to establish a permanent government in South Vietnam, one that would serve its geopolitical interests and block Ho Chi Minh from claiming full leadership. Thus, America set its sights on Ngo Dinh Diem, a staunch anti-communist figure who had lived in exile outside Vietnam during the years of war. Diem was seen as the perfect candidate, Western-educated, fiercely opposed to Ho Chi Minh, and willing to align his government with American ideals. But there was one problem. Diem lacked true support from the Vietnamese people, many of whom viewed him as an outsider, disconnected from their struggle for independence. Still, the US backed him relentlessly, ensuring his rise to power in South Vietnam, positioning him as the new barrier against communism. Diem's rise in South Vietnam with US backing was now set in motion. Vietnam had been promised reunification, but betrayal had sealed its fate instead, and soon, the war that was supposed to end would begin again, fiercer than ever before. Ngo Dinh Diem's rise to power in South Vietnam was not the product of overwhelming public support, but of calculated US intervention. The Geneva Accords had outlined a clear path toward national elections, set for 1956, in which the people of Vietnam would determine their country's leadership. But the United States, fearing that Ho Chi Minh's popularity would lead to an easy communist victory, decided that those elections would never happen. Instead, American officials orchestrated Diem's political ascent, ensuring that South Vietnam would remain divided, firmly under US influence, regardless of the people's will. Diem was portrayed as Vietnam's defender against communism, a strong-willed leader who could fortify the South against Ho Chi Minh's revolutionaries. But in reality, he was deeply unpopular among many Vietnamese citizens, particularly rural farmers who had suffered under his strict and often oppressive rule. He was Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist nation, elitist in a society yearning for grassroots leadership, and his government relied on corruption and repression to maintain control. Yet, with American backing, he consolidated power, dismissing dissenters, rigging elections, and using military force to silence those who opposed him. Ho Chi Minh, aware that the promised elections were never going to take place, saw this as an outright betrayal. The Vietnamese people had been denied their right to choose their future, and the division of the country, intended to be temporary, was now permanent. In the north, Ho solidified communist governance, ensuring that his forces were prepared for the long struggle ahead. In the south, resistance against Diem began to simmer, fueled by those who had once believed in the promise of reunification, but now saw only oppression and political deception. The fallout from the cancelled elections and rising discontent would soon lead Vietnam deeper into conflict. The battle for independence was no longer just against colonial rule. It was now a war against betrayal, corruption, and foreign influence, and it was only a matter of time before that discontent turned into full-scale rebellion. With the elections officially cancelled and Vietnam's promise of reunification abandoned, resentment in the south erupted into a growing rebellion. Ngo Dinh Diem, backed by American resources, ruled South Vietnam with an iron grip, crushing dissent and ensuring that no opposition could threaten his administration. But beneath the surface, discontent festered as the people of Vietnam, especially rural farmers and those who had once fought for independence, began to see Diem not as a leader, but as another oppressor, no different from the French who had ruled before him. Diem's administration heavily favored the Catholic minority, alienating the Buddhist majority, leading to protests, self-immolations, and deepening tensions across South Vietnam. The oppressive nature of his rule sparked insurgencies, leading directly to the rise of the National Liberation Front, SNLF, better known as the Viet Cong, a communist-backed revolutionary force determined to overthrow his government and reclaim Vietnam from foreign control. Meanwhile, in the north, Ho Chi Minh watched the situation unfold with careful precision. He knew that South Vietnam was crumbling from within, and he began secretly supporting the growing Viet Cong rebellion, supplying weapons, intelligence, and tactical strategies to weaken Diem's grip. The US response: more weapons, more money, more military advisors, believing that increasing aid would prevent South Vietnam's collapse. But this only fueled the resistance further, pushing the Viet Cong into a stronger position, while turning Diem into a leader who relied more on foreign support than his own people. By 1963, Diem had become a liability, hated by his own citizens, weakened by internal struggles, and no longer a stable ally for US interests. In a shocking turn of events, the US quietly supported a coup, leading to Diem's assassination. But rather than stabilizing South Vietnam, his death plunged the nation into deeper chaos, with no clear leadership, no unified government, and increasing unrest that made US intervention almost inevitable. And then, in 1964, an event occurred that would officially drag America into full-scale war: a mysterious naval confrontation off the coast of North Vietnam. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. Fact or fabrication? This encounter, shrouded in confusion and political maneuvering, would become the official justification for American military escalation, marking the beginning of one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in US history. In the warm, dark waters of the Gulf of Tonkin, an incident unfolded that would change the course of the Vietnam War, setting the stage for full-scale American military involvement. On the night of August 2, 1964, the USS Maddox, a US Navy destroyer, was conducting electronic surveillance off the coast of North Vietnam, gathering intelligence on Ho Chi Minh's forces. It was not merely a passive presence. It was part of America's expanding efforts to control Vietnam's future, a silent witness to the growing conflict between North and South. Then, without warning, Vietnamese patrol boats allegedly attacked the Maddox, launching torpedoes toward the vessel, prompting the destroyer to return fire. The clash was brief, chaotic, and poorly documented, yet within hours, U.S. officials presented it as an unprovoked act of aggression, a signal that North Vietnam was escalating tensions and threatening American forces. President Lyndon B. Johnson was informed and immediately authorized retaliatory airstrikes, hitting Vietnamese targets with precision bombing. But just 2 days later, on August 4, another supposed attack occurred, this time against both the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. Johnson ordered further retaliation, declaring that North Vietnamese forces had engaged in direct provocation, and insisting that America had no choice but to defend its interests in Vietnam. What followed was one of the most controversial moments in US history. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, long considered the justification for America's deep escalation in Vietnam, became one of the most debated events of the war, because evidence emerged suggesting that the second attack may have never happened at all. US intelligence officials later revealed major inconsistencies in the reports, including confused sonar readings, misidentified radar signals, and conflicting testimonies from military personnel. The truth was murky, and many historians now believe that the second engagement was exaggerated or entirely fabricated, used to manufacture public support for war. For Johnson, whether the attack was real no longer mattered. The political momentum had been set in motion. American outrage surged, and within days, Congress granted LBJ sweeping powers, authorizing him to take all necessary measures to repel any threat from North Vietnam, effectively handing him a blank check for military intervention. The Gulf of Tonkin was the final push, the moment when Vietnam transformed from a quiet battleground of covert operations into a full-fledged war, with American troops, bombers, and warships soon flooding the region. There was no turning back now. With the passage of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964, Congress handed President Lyndon B. Johnson unprecedented authority, granting him the power to wage war in Vietnam without a formal declaration. This resolution rushed through in the wake of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an attack that many historians now believe was exaggerated or entirely fabricated, gave LBJ the ability to escalate US involvement at will, allowing him to send troops, authorize bombings, and expand military operations without further approval from Congress. This was the moment when Vietnam transformed from a distant conflict into America's war, a war that would soon consume lives, resources, and public opinion. Before Tonkin, the US had only provided financial aid, weapons, and military advisors. But now, full-scale intervention was inevitable, with ground troops arriving by the thousands and bombers preparing for one of the most devastating air campaigns in history. Johnson, determined to crush North Vietnamese resistance and prevent the spread of communism, approved Operation Rolling Thunder, the relentless bombardment of North Vietnam that would forever define the brutality of the war. Rolling Thunder, the air war begins. What followed was carpet bombings, chemical warfare, napalm strikes, a campaign designed not just to destroy military targets, but to break the will of the Vietnamese people, turning villages into smoldering ruins, landscapes into toxic wastelands, and jungles into graves. The war was now truly unleashed, and the world would never be the same again. Operation Rolling Thunder, the largest sustained aerial bombardment in history at the time, was unleashed on North Vietnam in 1965, marking a terrifying new phase of the war. The United States, now fully entrenched in Vietnam, waged war from the skies, believing that relentless bombing would cripple Ho Chi Minh's forces, break the will of the Vietnamese people, and force the North to surrender. But Vietnam was not just a battlefield. It was a land of homes, families, villages, and histories, and Rolling Thunder did not distinguish between military targets and civilian lives. For 3 years, wave after wave of US bombers ripped through North Vietnam, dropping more explosives than had been used in all of World War II. Bridges, roads, supply lines, anything considered vital to the enemy's resistance was obliterated. But with those targets came schools, markets, houses, temples, villages filled with farmers, children, elders, all caught beneath the inferno of American air superiority. Carpet bombings turned cities into craters, jungles into wastelands, homes into ash. The American war effort was not just about explosions. It was about chemicals, toxic weapons that would wreak havoc for generations. One of the most devastating tools used in Rolling Thunder was Agent Orange, a deadly herbicide designed to strip Vietnam of its natural defenses. The dense jungles of Vietnam gave the Viet Cong an advantage, allowing them to move undetected, ambush enemy troops, and build hidden networks to evade capture. So, the US military sought to erase the jungle itself, spraying millions of gallons of Agent Orange over vast territories, poisoning forests, crops, rivers, and every living thing within them. What was once green turned to twisted skeletal remains, unrecognizable landscapes robbed of life. But the true horror of Agent Orange was not immediate. It was long-lasting, genetic, irreversible. Thousands of Vietnamese civilians were exposed, their bodies riddled with disease, cancer, and birth defects that would plague future generations. Children born years later would suffer deformities, their DNA irreparably altered by the toxins released during the war. American soldiers also faced the consequences, unknowingly drenched in chemicals that would later cause illness, psychological trauma, and premature deaths. The war ended, but Agent Orange never faded. It lingered in the soil, the water, the bodies of those who had breathed it in. Then came napalm, a weapon that did not just kill. It burned, it consumed, it turned flesh into molten agony. Dropped from fighter jets, napalm bombs exploded on impact, unleashing firestorms that could not be extinguished. Buildings incinerated in seconds. Entire villages vanished in flames, with civilians trapped beneath the inferno, their skin melted away by the scorching chemical fire. The smell of burning flesh became a permanent feature of Vietnam's war-torn skies. A reminder that this was not just a war of soldiers. It was a war that devoured everything in its path. The world began to witness the consequences of this destruction. The haunting images of burning villages and children. Photographs of terrified civilians fleeing flames, of children screaming in pain. Their skin seared and peeling from napalm attacks, spread across newspapers, forcing the world to ask, had the war gone too far? Vietnam was not just a battlefield. It was suffering. It was tragedy. It was death beyond measure. And the images would tell the story no words ever could. The images emerging from Vietnam were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Photographs of burning villages, smoke curling into the sky as families ran for their lives, faces twisted in fear, in pain, in incomprehensible loss. Some of the most haunting photos came from the aftermath of napalm strikes, where entire towns were reduced to smoldering ruins, and children ran, naked and screaming, their skin melting from the chemical fire, their bodies scarred beyond recognition. No longer confined to battlefield reports, this war was now being witnessed in real time, through the camera lenses of journalists who embedded themselves within the horrors of Vietnam, capturing the brutal reality of conflict, one that did not spare the innocent, One of the most iconic images, a photograph of a young girl known as Napalm Girl, running down a dirt road, her face twisted in pain, her clothes burned away, her arms stretched out as if reaching for help that would never come, became a defining moment in the world's understanding of Vietnam. This was not a war against soldiers alone. It was a war where entire communities were caught in the firestorm, where civilians became collateral damage, where children screamed in agony as bombs fell around them, their homes turned to rubble, their futures erased in an instant. The horror did not end with napalm. Villages were sprayed with Agent Orange, their landscapes stripped bare, their food sources poisoned, their rivers carrying chemicals that would alter generations to come. Farmers returned to their lands only to find that nothing would grow, that their bodies would grow sick, that their unborn children would carry the scars of a war they had never lived through. The global reaction was immediate and divided. Some defended the bombings, arguing that war required force, that the Viet Cong hid among civilians, that this destruction was necessary to end the conflict. Others saw the undeniable evidence of brutality. Photographs of limbless children, mothers cradling the bodies of infants, villages wiped off the map, proof that Vietnam was a war with no mercy, no boundaries, no restraint. But even as America rained destruction from the sky, it could not win the war through bombings alone. Rolling thunder was meant to break Vietnam's resistance, but instead it strengthened it, fueling deeper resentment, harder resistance, turning farmers into fighters, turning the Vietnamese people into soldiers who vowed never to surrender. This was a war without traditional front lines, a conflict where the enemy was everywhere, and nowhere at once, where jungles became battlegrounds, where the Vietnamese fighters adapted, outmaneuvered, and refused to fight by the rules of conventional warfare. Viet Cong guerrilla tactics would soon turn the tide, proving that no amount of bombs could truly defeat an enemy who lived among the land, who moved like shadows, who fought not just for territory, but for survival, for their homeland, for their future, and for America. That realization would come at a devastating cost. Vietnam was a battlefield unlike any other, a war with no clear front lines, no defined territories, no predictable enemy movements. The US military, accustomed to conventional warfare, entered Vietnam with superior firepower, advanced technology, and overwhelming air dominance, expecting that its massive arsenal would quickly crush resistance. But the Viet Cong did not fight by American rules. They did not rely on large-scale formations, traditional battlefields, or easily identifiable supply routes. Instead, they fought from the shadows, blending into the jungles, the villages, the rivers and mountains, disappearing into the land only to strike when least expected. Guerrilla warfare was their greatest weapon, and America soon found itself outmaneuvered by an enemy it could rarely see, let alone defeat. The Viet Cong operated with ruthless precision, using hit-and-run tactics, surprise attacks, and psychological warfare to wear down US forces over time. They understood that they could never match America's firepower directly, but they didn't need to. Their strategy was to make every road, every river crossing, every jungle path a battleground, ensuring that American troops were never safe, never able to predict where the next assault would come from. They struck quickly, retreated fast, and left chaos in their wake. US patrols would venture deep into Vietnamese territory, only to be ambushed by fighters who seemed to materialize out of nowhere, firing from the trees, the bushes, from the ground itself. One moment, the jungle was silent. The next, it was filled with gunfire, explosions, screams. The landscape of Vietnam was a perfect ally to the Viet Cong. Dense forests, winding rivers, towering mountains, and sprawling rice paddies became their home, their cover, their advantage. American soldiers, weighed down by equipment, unfamiliar with the terrain, and struggling in the oppressive heat, were at a constant disadvantage. Their enemy could vanish in an instant, their footprints swallowed by the mud, their bodies absorbed into the jungle like ghosts. The forests hid entire battalions. The rivers carried weapons from secret supply lines. And the villages served as sanctuaries for fighters who could melt into civilian populations only to strike again, when least expected. But the Viet Cong's greatest strength was their adaptability. They were not bound by conventional warfare, by rigid formations or strict supply routes. Everything they had, they made do with. Every scrap of metal became a weapon. Every fallen tree became a barricade. Every piece of discarded American equipment was repurposed into tools for survival. They fought with AK-47s and captured US rifles, but also with homemade grenades, sharpened bamboo spears, and landmines crafted from salvaged explosives. They did not need air power. They needed patience, knowledge, the willingness to endure long, brutal struggles that would wear down the enemy over months and years. The US military, accustomed to direct confrontations, grew increasingly frustrated by the war's unpredictability. They bombed entire forests, burned villages, sprayed chemicals to strip away the jungle cover. But the Viet Cong remained, always reappearing, always fighting. Traditional military strategy proved useless against an enemy that refused to fight in traditional ways. This was Vietnam's greatest advantage. Their war was fought in the shadows, in the dense jungles beneath the earth itself. And soon, the full extent of their tactics would be revealed. Booby traps, tunnels, and jungle warfare would turn Vietnam into a battlefield unlike anything America had ever faced, where even the ground was a threat, where every step could be fatal, where every soldier felt the suffocating paranoia of a war fought in the unseen. The jungle was not just a setting. It was the Viet Cong's weapon, their fortress, their greatest ally in the fight for survival. The Vietnamese jungles were more than just terrain. They were weapons, battlegrounds, homes, and fortresses, shaped by war and adapted for survival. To American soldiers, the dense vegetation, twisting trails, and suffocating humidity were a nightmare, a place where danger lurked behind every tree, beneath every step, above every clearing. But for the Viet Cong, the jungle was an ally, a shield, a labyrinth of survival, allowing them to strike without warning, disappear without a trace, and reappear miles away to strike again. Vietnam was not a war fought with front lines and military bases. It was a war fought in the shadows, underground, within the earth itself. One of the most terrifying realities for American troops was the presence of booby traps, hidden everywhere, waiting to claim victims in the most gruesome ways imaginable. Every step could mean instant death or a lifetime of suffering. The Viet Cong, knowing they could not match American firepower, turned the landscape into a deadly minefield, rigging paths, villages, even rivers with traps designed to maim rather than kill, forcing the US to deal with wounded soldiers and psychological terror on a daily basis. Punji stake pits were among the most common and horrific traps. Simple holes dug into the ground, lined with sharpened bamboo stakes that had been coated with poison, feces, or other bacteria to cause infection. A soldier who fell into one wouldn't just be injured. He'd be crippled, forced to endure agonizing pain, often leading to amputation or death from septic shock. Then there were tripwire grenades, explosives hidden in seemingly safe paths. triggered the moment a soldier unknowingly disturbed the wire. Entire patrols were shattered in seconds, caught in a blast that would tear through bodies, sending limbs flying, leaving survivors with permanent wounds. But it wasn't just the ground that was dangerous. The Viet Cong weaponized nature itself, constructing traps where spiked logs would swing down from trees, crushing soldiers on impact, or hidden pits filled with venomous snakes, ensuring that even a seemingly peaceful clearing could turn into a death sentence within moments. The psychological toll was staggering. American soldiers couldn't trust the land, couldn't trust the air, couldn't trust the rivers, forcing them into a state of constant paranoia, never knowing if the next step would be their last. And then there were the tunnels. A world beneath Vietnam, an intricate network of underground passageways that allowed the Viet Cong to vanish into the earth, emerging miles away after an ambush, leaving US troops confused and enraged. The tunnels weren't simply hiding places. They were command centers, supply depots, sleeping quarters, entire cities carved beneath the soil, where Viet Cong fighters could launch an attack and disappear without a trace, leaving their enemy firing blindly into an empty jungle. The Cu Chi tunnels, located near Saigon, were a sprawling underground maze, stretching for hundreds of miles, deep beneath the surface, where Viet Cong forces could travel unseen, store weapons, plan attacks, and even operate makeshift hospitals and schools. Some passages were so narrow that only the Vietnamese fighters could fit, ensuring that even if an American soldier tried to chase them down, they'd be trapped, suffocating in the tight, airless corridors. For US forces, combating the tunnels was a living nightmare. Special units called tunnel rats were sent in, small soldiers trained to navigate the claustrophobic passageways, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a pistol, crawling through pitch black tunnels that could collapse at any moment, knowing that at any turn a hidden enemy could strike. Many never returned. The Viet Cong booby trapped their tunnels, rigging them with explosives, placing hidden spike pits within them, ensuring that any soldier who dared enter could face instant death. It was not just war. It was psychological warfare, a battle designed to break the mind as much as the body. The tunnels, the traps, the jungle warfare transformed Vietnam into a battleground of ghosts, where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once, where soldiers fired into the darkness, unsure if they were hitting shadows or real targets. Bombing raids were ineffective. The tunnels ran so deep that explosives couldn't reach them. Napalm burned the forests, but couldn't touch the underground fortresses. Even when the US unleashed chemical warfare, spraying defoliants to strip away the jungle cover, the tunnels remained untouched, preserving the Viet Cong's greatest advantage. It was a war where the American soldiers were not just outmaneuvered. They were fighting an enemy they could barely see, barely predict, barely understand. American soldiers fighting an invisible enemy, an enemy that knew the land better, adapted faster, endured more, and refused to surrender, no matter how many bombs rained from the sky. In the jungles of Vietnam, American soldiers faced an enemy they could not pin down, an enemy who moved like ghosts, struck without warning, and disappeared before a counterattack could be launched. This war was unlike any conflict the United States had fought before. There were no clear front lines, no cities to capture, no grand strategic movements that could be measured by territorial gains. Every road could be an ambush site. Every village could house Viet Cong sympathizers. Every innocent-looking farmer could be carrying a rifle, ready to attack the moment a patrol passed by. Vietnam was not a war of conquest. It was a war of attrition, where success was not determined by capturing cities or controlling regions, but by wearing down the enemy until they could no longer fight. The problem: the Viet Cong were masters of survival, adapting to every tactic the US military threw at them. Bombings destroyed villages, but the fighters moved deeper into the jungle. Napalm scorched the earth, but tunnels shielded them from the flames. Agent Orange stripped away the vegetation, but the resistance remained unbroken. US forces had the advantage in firepower, air support, and logistical operations, yet none of it seemed to stop the war from dragging on, grinding soldiers down, eroding morale one ambush at a time. The frustration grew unbearable. American commanders, desperate to prove progress in a war that had no traditional victories, began measuring success not by land gained, but by bodies counted. How many Viet Cong fighters had been killed? How many bodies could be recovered after an engagement? How many corpses could be displayed to prove that the war was being won? Thus began the body count strategy, a grim, horrifying method of gauging success by piling up enemy dead, where soldiers were encouraged not just to fight, but to rack up numbers, to kill as many as possible, regardless of the circumstances. Success was measured in corpses. And with that mentality, the war descended into something even darker, where morality blurred, where civilians were slaughtered alongside combatants, where the need for high numbers led to indiscriminate killing. The body count dictated the war's direction, and in the jungles, the killing would never truly stop. The Vietnam War was unlike any conflict the United States had fought before, and with no clear victories to claim, US military leaders needed a way to prove that the war was being won. Since Vietnam lacked conventional front lines, and since capturing territory meant little in a war of attrition, success became measured not in land gained, but in bodies counted. This grim metric, the body count strategy, turned the war into a numbers game, where commanders pushed for higher kill counts to justify progress, where soldiers were incentivized not just to fight, but to kill as many as possible, and where the line between combatant and civilian became dangerously blurred. Under intense pressure to report success, officers began exaggerating kill counts, inflating numbers to give the impression that victory was near. In some cases, the dead were counted multiple times, with bodies stacked and re-photographed to artificially boost reports. Entire villages were marked as enemy casualties. Even when they housed civilians, their deaths lumped into the statistics as collateral damage, ignored as mere numbers on a report. Inflated kill counts and the rise in civilian deaths painted a horrifying picture. One where the war was no longer just about defeating the enemy, but about maintaining the illusion of progress, where villages were turned to ash, not because they housed combatants, but because high numbers made a war appear winnable. And as these numbers continued to rise, Vietnam's jungles became graveyards. Its rivers ran thick with blood, and its people bore the consequences of a war fought without restraint. But behind those figures, the truth was far grimmer than any report could ever reveal. The numbers kept rising, but behind each statistic was a grim reality. Each corpse counted in reports had once been a living person, and many of them were not soldiers, but civilians caught in the crossfire. The pressure to prove progress in a war with no clear victory led American commanders to demand higher body counts from troops on the ground. The expectation was clear: every engagement needed results, every mission needed dead enemies, every battle needed bodies to justify America's continued presence in Vietnam. But with Viet Cong forces often blending into local villages, disappearing into the jungle, or operating without uniforms. The distinction between combatants and civilians blurred dangerously. Entire hamlets were wiped out under the assumption that they were harboring the enemy. Innocent men, women, and children became casualties of a war measured in numbers, their deaths written off as collateral damage or falsely categorized as insurgents. To reach the targets set by commanders, some officers encouraged exaggerated reports, inflating kill counts, counting every body, regardless of age or allegiance, toward the official toll. Photographs were staged to make strikes appear more effective than they really were. Corpses were recounted multiple times, and massacres were justified as necessary operations, their true horrors concealed under military bureaucracy. One of the most infamous incidents was the My Lai massacre, in which US troops systematically slaughtered over 500 unarmed villagers, including infants and elderly men and women, under the false assumption that the hamlet was crawling with Viet Cong fighters. The killings were brutal, indiscriminate, and unprovoked, yet they were initially reported as a successful mission, a necessary strike against the enemy. When the truth leaked, the world recoiled in horror, further unraveling the illusion that Vietnam was a war fought with precision and morality. American soldiers were not just facing an enemy in the jungles. They were battling the pressures of a war that demanded death as proof of success, where the lines between duty and murder became dangerously thin. This psychological burden weighed heavily on troops, breaking morale, fueling trauma, and creating an environment where many felt more lost than victorious. And as the war continued, its human cost became unbearable, not just for the Vietnamese people, but for the soldiers sent to fight it. Psychological toll on troops, the endless body counts, the blurred morality, the constant fear and paranoia took a deep and irreversible toll. Vietnam was not just a battlefield. It was a war that would haunt those who fought in it for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll of Vietnam was unlike anything American soldiers had ever faced. For many, the war had lost any sense of morality, turning into a nightmare of endless engagements, unseen enemies, and unbearable pressure to justify their presence with body counts rather than victories. The jungles became places of paranoia, where every step could trigger a deadly booby trap, where villages looked friendly one moment and hostile the next, where the enemy did not wear uniforms, but blended into the fabric of daily life, disappearing into the shadows as soon as they struck. The stress was overwhelming. Many soldiers never knew who was truly a threat, forced to question whether a farmer was simply tending his crops or waiting to ambush them. The pressure to maintain kill counts turned into fear, suspicion, and desperation, leading some to lash out indiscriminately, attacking villages based on assumption rather than intelligence. The constant trauma shattered nerves, eroded judgment, and led to some of the darkest moments in American military history. Vietnam was a war that did not end when soldiers left the battlefield. It stayed with them long after the helicopters flew home, embedded in their minds as guilt, nightmares, and regret. Many returned haunted, unable to reintegrate into normal life, carrying the horrors of war inside them, struggling with post-traumatic stress that had no name yet, but was fully real. And for some soldiers, those horrors were not just witnessed, they were committed. In the heat of paranoia, under orders that encouraged high kill counts, and in a war where morality had unraveled, some units crossed a line that could never be undone. Har ars ont h graroend. The My Lai massacre, one of the darkest chapters of the Vietnam War, unfolded in the village of My Lai, where hundreds of innocent civilians were slaughtered in a single day. This massacre would become one of the most devastating stains on America's military history, an atrocity that no justification could ever erase. And what happened there would be remembered forever. Not just by history, but by those who lived through it. On the morning of March 16, 1968, U.S. Army soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment entered the small village of My Lai, located in Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. They had been briefed to expect Viet Cong resistance, told that the enemy was hiding among civilians, that this was a stronghold of communist guerrillas, and that they needed to clear the village completely. Armed with rifles, grenades, flamethrowers, and a ruthless order to eliminate all threats, the soldiers moved in. But there were no armed fighters waiting for them. No ambushes, no resistance, only villagers, women, children, elders, unarmed, unprepared, and unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, a brutal and calculated slaughter that would become one of the darkest stains on American military history. The soldiers, believing they had full authorization to clear out the area, began rounding up civilians, executing them in groups, forcing mothers, fathers, and children into ditches before gunning them down en masse. Houses were burned, livestock killed, rice supplies destroyed, as the soldiers systematically executed the helpless. Women were raped and murdered. Infants were shot at point blank range. Elderly men and women were brutally killed, their bodies left to rot in the streets. There was no resistance, only terror. Some soldiers hesitated, questioning the orders, realizing that this was not war but outright murder. But others fully embraced the carnage, carrying out their actions without remorse. Grenades were thrown into houses, flamethrowers incinerated families, and even those who begged for mercy, who pleaded for their lives, were executed without hesitation. By the time the killing stopped, over 500 unarmed civilians had been slaughtered. And in the coming months, the truth of My Lai would slowly emerge, shocking the world, exposing the brutal reality of a war that had spiraled into something far worse than anyone had imagined. The massacre at My Lai was not an accident, not a misunderstanding, not a fog of war incident where confusion led to unintended casualties. It was systematic, deliberate, and horrifyingly precise, a calculated act of brutality that left over 500 unarmed civilians dead. Villagers who had no weapons, no defenses, no way to fight back. The killing continued for hours, stretching across households, fields, and roads, leaving bodies stacked in ditches, burned in huts, riddled with bullets where they had once stood. Mothers clutched their children as gunfire tore through them. Entire families were dragged into execution zones, lined up and shot, and even infants, barely old enough to walk, were killed without hesitation. The soldiers showed no mercy, fueled by orders to clear the village, by the dehumanization of Vietnamese civilians, and by a war that had taught them to see every face as a potential enemy, every village as a breeding ground for insurgents. Some soldiers hesitated, realizing the horror of what they were being asked to do. A handful refused. Some tried to stop the massacre. Some broke down, horrified at what their own brothers, in arms, were doing. But the killing did not stop, and those few voices of protest were drowned out by chaos, by gunfire, by the relentless drive to win a war that had no true victories. By the time the gunfire ended, My Lai was gone, the people erased, their homes burned, their fields littered with corpses. But what happened there could not be hidden forever. Though initial reports framed the event as a successful engagement against Viet Cong forces, the truth would soon begin to unravel. Cover-up attempts and eventual exposure. For months, The US military tried to bury the massacre, to frame the deaths as unfortunate collateral damage, to rewrite the story of My Lai. But some soldiers knew what had really happened, and they refused to stay silent. Soon, the world would know the truth, and My Lai would become a name that could never be forgotten. In the immediate aftermath of My Lai, the US military did everything it could to bury the truth, framing the event as just another engagement in the war, a necessary strike against Viet Cong forces in hostile territory. Early reports made no mention of the massacre, instead describing a victory, a successful clearing operation, a mission that had weakened the enemy. The bodies, hundreds of them, were labeled as insurgents, as combatants, as acceptable collateral damage in a war where civilian casualties were unavoidable. But for some of the soldiers who had witnessed the horror firsthand, silence was impossible. Among them was Ron Ridenhour, an army helicopter gunner who, though not present at the massacre itself, heard first-hand accounts from fellow soldiers who had participated in the killing. He refused to ignore what he had learned, gathering testimonies, compiling details, and writing a powerful letter to Washington officials, demanding that the military investigate what had truly happened at My Lai. His persistence forced the US government to acknowledge the event, leading to a formal inquiry. But the army still attempted to control the narrative, delaying the investigation, downplaying the severity, shifting blame away from higher command and onto individual soldiers, painting My Lai as an unfortunate battlefield, excess rather than a deliberate act of mass murder. When journalist Seymour Hersh uncovered the massacre and published an explosive report in 1969, the world was forced to see the truth, and the images that surfaced were undeniable. Photos of slaughtered women, charred bodies, children executed in groups, entire villages wiped off the map. The illusion of Vietnam as a war of strategy, precision, and righteousness was shattered. My Lai became a global symbol of the war's brutality, and the US government could no longer deny what had happened. Someone had to be held accountable. Linty Calley's trial and controversial pardon. When blame was assigned, one name stood above the rest. Lieutenant William Calley, the officer who had led the massacre, who had ordered troops to execute civilians, who had participated in the killing himself. The trial would be one of the most controversial in US military history, dividing public opinion and raising questions about justice, war, and responsibility in a conflict where morality had all but collapsed. And in the end, his fate would shock the world. Lieutenant William Calley stood trial for his role in the My Lai massacre, accused of ordering and directly participating in the execution of hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians. The US Army, under pressure to show accountability, charged Calley with murder, making him the primary scapegoat for the atrocity. But the trial was not simply about justice. It was about the moral reckoning of America's actions in Vietnam, about whether responsibility lay with a single officer or with the system that had led soldiers into this war of confusion, paranoia, and endless body counts. At trial, Calley defended his actions, arguing that he had simply followed orders, that his unit had been briefed to clear out the village, that the killings were not an act of personal cruelty, but a necessary part of military operations. He claimed that the chaos of war blurred distinctions between combatants and civilians, that he believed My Lai housed Viet Cong fighters, and that he had no choice but to obey the command given to him. But the evidence painted a damning picture, with survivors testifying to the indiscriminate slaughter, describing how men, women, and children were rounded up and executed without cause, how soldiers laughed, as they fired into groups of terrified civilians. How My Lai was not just an attack, it was a deliberate act of mass murder. In 1971, Cali was convicted, found guilty of killing at least 22 civilians, though the true number was likely far higher. His sentence was life in prison. But what happened next shocked the world. The public rallied behind Cali, painting him not as a murderer, but as a soldier caught in an impossible war, a man punished for following orders while those who had sent him there remained untouched. Protests erupted, politicians called for leniency, and President Richard Nixon intervened, reducing Cali's sentence drastically. Instead of life imprisonment, Cali was placed under house arrest, and in 1974, he was fully pardoned, walking free without ever serving true justice for the crimes committed at My Lai. The trial raised disturbing questions about accountability in war, about whether soldiers could be blamed for actions they were ordered to commit, about the morality of Vietnam itself, a conflict where killing had become routine, where every body count justified continued engagement, where morality had crumbled beneath the weight of strategy and survival. My Lai became a symbol of the war's darkest truths, a reminder that Vietnam was never just a conflict between armies. It was a war where innocence was often the first casualty. And while Cali walked free, thousands of young American men were being sent into Vietnam, not by choice, but by force, caught in the system of the draft, lottery of the damned. The US military needed soldiers, and so it turned to the draft, pulling young men, often poor, often minorities, into a war they never volunteered for, forcing them to fight in a conflict many did not understand, many did not believe in, and many would never return from. Vietnam was not just fought by generals, it was fought by the reluctant, the unwilling, the sacrificed. And as the draft continued, resistance would rise, and America's faith in the war would begin to crumble. The Vietnam War did not just consume soldiers, it consumed entire generations, pulling young men into its grasp, sending them into battle whether they wanted to fight or not. Unlike previous wars where enlistment was voluntary, Vietnam relied heavily on the draft, forcing young Americans, many barely out of high school, into the jungles, into the chaos, into the nightmare. The system was supposed to be random, fair, indiscriminate, but in reality, the draft disproportionately affected the poor, the working class, and minorities, while the wealthy, the connected, and those in privileged positions found ways to escape. If you were rich, if you had political influence, if you could secure college enrollment or medical exemptions, you had options. If you were poor, if you lived in a small town with no connections, if you had no money to fight the system, you were going to Vietnam. For many young men, the draft was not a call to duty. It was a death sentence, a ticket to a war they didn't believe in, didn't understand, didn't ask for. Some accepted their fate, stepping onto the transport planes, saying goodbye to families who feared they would never return. Others desperately tried to find ways out, searching for loopholes, doctors willing to write false medical reports, or enlistment options that might station them somewhere safer. But for those who refused, who saw Vietnam as a war built on lies, who believed that fighting was not an act of patriotism, but an act of submission to a corrupt system, their options were even more limited. Draft dodging, exile to Canada, became a path chosen by thousands. Rather than fight, rather than die in a war they did not believe in, they left America behind, crossing the border, becoming fugitives in their own country, sacrificing everything to escape the war that had stolen their future. For many, they would never return home again. And Vietnam continued to take its toll, even on those who refused to fight it. For thousands of young American men, Vietnam was not a war they volunteered for. It was a war that chose them, plucking their names from a draft system that showed little mercy, little fairness, little regard for individual choice. As the war dragged on, as casualty numbers climbed into the tens of thousands, many refused to accept their fate, seeking every possible way to avoid being sent into the jungles, into the slaughter, into a war that no longer made sense. Some found legal loopholes, securing medical exemptions, enrolling in certain programs, claiming hardships that made them ineligible for service. Others simply disappeared, ignoring draft notices, avoiding recruitment officers, living in the shadows. But for those who took the most drastic step, escape meant leaving the United States entirely, abandoning their homes, their families, their futures, and fleeing across the border into Canada. Seeking refuge in a country that did not force them into war, draft dodgers faced immense consequences. If caught, they risked prison time, fines, public disgrace, branded as cowards, traitors, unpatriotic criminals. Many never returned, choosing instead to build new lives in exile, disconnected from everything they had ever known. Canada, while welcoming, was never truly home. It was a place of survival, not belonging. A land where dodgers could stay safe, but could never truly reclaim what they had lost. In the United States, opinions on draft dodgers were deeply divided. Some believed they were right to resist, refusing to be sacrificed for a war built on deception and politics. Others saw them as selfish, weak, unworthy of American citizenship, a stain on the military's honor. When the war ended, many dodgers wished to return, but home was no longer waiting for them. The U.S. government struggled to decide how to treat them, and while some were granted pardons, many remained in exile for decades, unable to reconcile with the country that had once tried to force them into battle. But while some fled, others never had the option to leave. College deferments and class disparity shaped the draft system in a way that disproportionately targeted the poor, the working class, and minorities, ensuring that those without financial privilege had no escape. If you were wealthy, if you had connections, if you could secure a spot in a university, your name was removed from the draft lists, kept safe while others were sent to die. And so, Vietnam became a war fought not by America's elite, but by its struggling youth, thrown into combat, while those who could afford to avoid it watched from the safety of lecture halls, law offices, and corporate careers. The draft was never truly equal. It was a system that favored those with power and punished those without. And in the end, those sent to fight would never forget that bitter truth. Vietnam was never just about soldiers. It was about politics, privilege, and a nation tearing itself apart from within. The Vietnam War was never truly equal. While some young men had the luxury of escaping the draft, others had no way out, forced into combat simply because they lacked wealth, connections, or privileged access to education. College deferments were the ultimate shield, protecting those who could afford tuition, who had families with influence, who could navigate the loopholes and bureaucracy that kept them safe. If a young man was enrolled in a university, he could avoid the draft, delaying his service while others, mostly poor, mostly working class, and disproportionately minorities, were sent into battle instead. This created a stark divide, separating those who could study in lecture halls from those forced into the jungles, where survival was not determined by intelligence, but by luck, instinct, and an unforgiving battlefield. It was a brutal truth. The ones who had options stayed home, while the ones who didn't became soldiers, fighting a war they had never chosen, risking their lives while others continued their studies, their careers, their futures untouched. The system favored the privileged, shielding America's elite, while the poor bore the brunt of the war's brutality. And as Vietnam dragged on, the weight of the conflict grew unbearable for those trapped within it. The pressures of combat, the isolation, the moral confusion created a deep psychological crisis among troops, leaving many disillusioned, detached, and desperately searching for escape. Some found solace in camaraderie, in brotherhood, in a shared sense of survival. Others turned to a different form of relief, one that came in the form of drugs. Drugs, despair, and the disillusioned soldier. With nowhere to turn, with war tearing away their sanity, with survival feeling more like a lottery than a skill, many soldiers fell into the grip of heroin and marijuana, seeking temporary refuge from the nightmare that had consumed them. But addiction did not save them. It dragged them deeper, turning Vietnam not just into a war, but into an abyss from which many would never return the same again. Vietnam was not just a war of bullets and bombs. It was a war of minds, of souls, of endurance, where American soldiers fought not only the enemy, but their own demons, struggling to survive both the battlefields and the psychological collapse that came with them. For many troops, the horrors of war were too much to bear, and with no escape, they turned to the only solace available: drugs. Heroin and marijuana flowed through the ranks of American forces, becoming a silent epidemic, offering troops a temporary escape from the brutality that surrounded them. The constant stress, the fear of ambush, the images of burned villages and dead civilians, it was too much for many soldiers to process. Alcohol wasn't enough. Cigarettes couldn't calm the nerves, and so heroin became the answer, flooding through military camps, traded among soldiers, even finding its way into distribution networks run within Vietnam itself. By 1971, reports estimated that nearly half of US troops in Vietnam had experimented with heroin, with as many as 20% addicted. The drug turned hardened soldiers into the hollow-eyed, disconnected remnants of themselves, moving mechanically through operations, numbed to the violence, dependent on heroin to keep functioning. The US military was painfully aware of the problem, but did little to stop it. Morale was already collapsing, desertions were rising, and the American public was losing faith in the war. If drugs kept troops obedient, kept them on the battlefield, kept them moving through the daily routine of killing and survival, then it was tolerated. Marijuana was less severe, but equally common, smoked openly in barracks, passed between troops before deadly missions, easing anxiety, fear, and anger. Soldiers were losing faith in the war, losing faith in their commanders, losing faith in the idea that Vietnam could ever be won. And as disillusionment turned into frustration, frustration turned into anger, and anger turned into open rebellion against the officers leading them. Fragging. Soldiers killing their own officers. When command failed to protect them, when the war felt like a meaningless death sentence, when leadership refused to acknowledge the suffering of its own troops, some soldiers took matters into their own hands, turning their weapons not against the Viet Cong, but against their own officers. Vietnam was spiraling out of control, and fragging became a terrifying symptom of that collapse. Vietnam had become a war of chaos, distrust, and survival. And for many American soldiers, the enemy was not just the Viet Cong, it was their own officers. By the late stages of the war, morale had completely collapsed, and frustration boiled over into outright rebellion. Troops felt abandoned, sent into battles they knew were futile, ordered into ambushes they could not escape, commanded by officers who seemed indifferent to their suffering. Some believed their leaders were sacrificing them for promotions, pushing them into danger purely to increase body counts. And in the most extreme cases, soldiers turned their guns on their commanders. Fragging, the deliberate killing of officers by their own troops, became a horrifying symptom of Vietnam's unraveling war effort. Named after fragmentation grenades, which were often used in attacks because they could kill without leaving clear evidence. Fragging was not a random act of rage. It was calculated, planned, and carried out with intent. Officers who were too aggressive, too reckless, too blindly loyal to command were marked for death by their own men. Killed in accidents, in ambushes that weren't enemy, driven in explosions that conveniently struck at the wrong moment. Some officers were murdered in their sleep, their tents torn apart by grenades thrown by the very soldiers they were supposed to lead. The military tried to suppress the truth, afraid to admit that Vietnam had become a war where American soldiers were fighting not only the Viet Cong, but their own leadership. But the numbers could not be ignored. Fragging incidents rose sharply toward the war's end, signaling the complete collapse of discipline, trust, and loyalty within the ranks. And as fragging spread, another, darker crisis loomed over the soldiers trapped in Vietnam. The psychological toll of the war. The trauma, the paranoia, the guilt, the constant fear began to consume those who had survived the battles but could not escape their memories. Suicides and PTSD emerging in real time. For some troops, the war did not end when they left Vietnam. It stayed with them, haunting them, breaking them down from the inside. Many could not face their own actions, their own past, the blood on their hands, and for too many, the only escape left was death, not at the hands of the enemy, but by their own choice. Vietnam was destroying minds as much as bodies, and long before the war officially ended, its psychological scars were already permanent. Vietnam was not just a war fought on the battlefield. It was a war that followed soldiers home, embedding itself in their minds. Their nightmares, their daily existence long after they left the jungles behind. The trauma did not disappear when the war ended. Instead, it festered, consuming veterans in ways they never imagined, turning them into ghosts walking through a world that no longer understood them. For many, surviving the war was not the same as escaping it. The violence, the fear, the guilt, it never truly left. Soldiers returned carrying memories of burnt villages, of comrades lost, of decisions that could never be undone. The faces of the dead haunted them. The weight of their actions crushed them. And with no true outlet for their suffering, many fell into despair, addiction, self-destruction. PTSD was not officially recognized yet, but its symptoms were everywhere among Vietnam veterans. The constant nightmares, the flashbacks, the inability to function in daily life, the extreme emotional detachment, all signs of an invisible wound that refused to heal. Some vets could not sleep without reliving their worst moments. Others could not walk down the street without believing they were back in the war, seeing threats in every shadow, hearing echoes of gunfire where there was silence. The lack of support only worsened the crisis. Many veterans returned home to a country that did not welcome them, a country divided over the war, where soldiers were often seen not as heroes, but as symbols of an unwanted conflict. Some were spit on, called murderers, denied the respect that had been given to soldiers in previous wars. Others simply faded into the background, ignored, struggling alone. Suicide rates skyrocketed, alcoholism consumed families. Entire communities watched the men crumble under the weight of something they could not explain. And while veterans suffered in silence, America itself was boiling over with anger. The war had fractured the nation, sparking outrage, rebellion, and protest. The battlefield was no longer just in Vietnam. It was in the streets of America itself. Ti war et hamon. Protest and fire. America turns on itself. The anti-war movement exploded into violence. Campuses became battlegrounds, and at Kent State University, the ultimate tragedy unfolded. An event that would change the course of American history forever. The Kent State shootings, mass protests. America had reached a boiling point, and now its own government was firing on its own citizens. Vietnam was not just a distant war. It was tearing America apart from within. Vietnam had fractured the American conscience, turning streets into battlegrounds, campuses into rallying points, and families against one another. The war was no longer fought just in Southeast Asia. It was fought in protests, in speeches, in angry demonstrations, in fists raised in defiance of a government that refused to listen. The anti-war movement grew into one of the largest political uprisings in US history, pulling together students, veterans, activists, and ordinary Americans who refused to accept Vietnam as a justified conflict. For years, protests had built momentum, challenging the draft, exposing the horrors of My Lai, demanding an end to a war that had claimed too many lives and drained too much of the nation's spirit. But on May 4, 1970, at Kent State University, the fury and fear of the war reached a devastating climax, when American troops turned their guns not on foreign soldiers, but on their own citizens. A student-led protest erupted on Kent State's campus, fueled by the growing anti-war sentiment, by the anger over President Nixon's recent escalation of the conflict into Cambodia, by the frustration of young Americans who saw no future outside of conscription and bloodshed. The National Guard was deployed, armed, ready to suppress the demonstration. But what was meant to be crowd control turned into a massacre. The guardsmen opened fire, sending bullets tearing through students. 4 young Americans lay dead, their lives erased in a moment of chaos. Their bodies crumpled onto the pavement as their classmates screamed in horror. 9 more were wounded, and in the aftermath, the photos, the haunting image of a young woman kneeling over a fallen protester, her scream frozen in time, became symbols of a war that had gone far beyond the battlefield. The killings at Kent State sent shockwaves across the country, proving that Vietnam was not just a distant war. It had reached American soil, turning rifles inward, showing that the government would silence dissent by any means necessary. The backlash was immediate. Millions of Americans marched in protest. Universities shut down in strikes. The pressure to end the war intensified like never before. And amid the chaos, another powerful force emerged. Leaders from the civil rights movement, once focused purely on racial justice, began turning against the war, recognizing that Vietnam was more than just foreign policy. It was a war that disproportionately targeted Black Americans, poor communities, and the already oppressed. Civil rights leaders turning against the war, Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, and countless activists raised their voices, declaring that Vietnam was an extension of America's systemic inequalities, draining resources from communities that needed aid, not war. The fight for racial justice and the fight against Vietnam became intertwined. And as protests grew louder, the government could no longer ignore the voices demanding change. The war was nearing its breaking point, and soon, the final unraveling would begin. The Vietnam War was never just about soldiers and battlefields. It was about power, oppression, and the systemic inequalities woven into American society. As the war escalated, as the draft disproportionately targeted Black Americans, Latinos, and the poor, as government spending poured into Vietnam, while domestic struggles were ignored, civil rights leaders saw Vietnam for what it truly was, a war that mirrored the injustice they had been fighting all their lives. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the first major voices to denounce the war, saw Vietnam as an extension of racial oppression, arguing that the U.S. government was sending young black men to fight for freedoms in Southeast Asia that they themselves did not have in their own country. In his speech, Beyond Vietnam, King declared that America had betrayed its own values, sacrificing the lives of its marginalized citizens for imperial ambitions. He called for an end to the war, exposing the moral hypocrisy of a nation that demanded sacrifice from the oppressed, while continuing to deny them justice at home. Muhammad Ali, the world heavyweight boxing champion, took one of the most dramatic stands against the war, refusing to be drafted, declaring that he would not fight a war that oppressed people abroad while Black Americans were still being lynched and denied their rights in their own country. His defiance led to his boxing titles being stripped, his passport revoked, his reputation attacked. But he stood firm, inspiring thousands to question the morality of Vietnam. The Black Panthers condemned Vietnam as a war designed to weaken black communities, sending their strongest young men into a conflict that offered nothing in return but trauma and death. Malcolm X, before his assassination, warned that Vietnam was another form of colonialism, a war where America exploited its own citizens to maintain global power. With civil rights leaders turning against the war, Vietnam lost even more credibility as protests merged racial justice with anti-war activism, creating a massive movement that no government propaganda could silence. And as these voices grew louder, the media became one of the most powerful forces in shaping the public's perception of Vietnam. The credibility gap and media coverage. For the first time in history, war was not hidden behind government-controlled reports. It was seen directly in living rooms across America as journalists exposed the lies, the failures, the mass deaths that Washington desperately wanted to downplay. The U.S. government was losing control of the narrative, and the truth was now impossible to suppress. Vietnam was unraveling, both on the battlefield and at home. Vietnam was not just a war, it was a crisis of truth, a conflict fought as much in newspapers and television screens as on the battlefield. For decades, wars had been presented to the public through controlled government reports, carefully curated to ensure that Americans believed in the righteousness of their country's actions. But Vietnam was different. It was the first war fully exposed by the media, the first war where journalists directly challenged government narratives, the first war where Americans saw the gruesome reality of combat in their own living rooms. Unedited, uncensored, undeniable. The credibility gap, the growing divide between what the U.S. government told its citizens and what the media revealed, became impossible to ignore. While officials claimed victory was near, reports from the front lines showed a different truth. One of stalemates, mounting casualties, and villages turned to ashes. Television broadcasts aired footage of bombings, screaming civilians, terrified soldiers covered in mud and blood, forcing Americans to see the war in a way that could not be spun, could not be manipulated, could not be hidden. The turning point came in 1968 when the Tet Offensive, a massive, coordinated attack by North Vietnamese forces, shattered the illusion that America was winning the war. U.S. officials had spent years insisting that victory was close, that the Viet Cong were weakened, That progress was undeniable. But when the offensive struck, when American bases were overrun, when fighting erupted across dozens of cities, when the enemy showed strength instead of retreat, the public finally understood that they had been lied to. Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted news anchor, declared on national television that Vietnam was unwinnable, marking a dramatic shift in perception. Public support collapsed, protests intensified, and the pressure to expose the full truth of the war became overwhelming. Then, in 1971, the biggest leak in U.S. military history emerged: the Pentagon Papers. Truth leaked. Whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. The documents contained decades of classified reports, proving that government officials had lied about Vietnam from the very beginning. They revealed that presidents knew the war was failing yet continued sending troops, that casualties were covered up, that decisions were made not to protect democracy, but to maintain political power. The leak would shake America to its core, exposing secrets the government never wanted its citizens to see. And once the truth was out, there was no turning back. Vietnam was officially exposed. In 1971, the Vietnam War's worst kept secrets were finally dragged into the light, exposing decades of deception, manipulation, and outright lies that had fueled America's military campaign. The revelations came in the form of the Pentagon Papers, a classified report commissioned by the U.S. Department of Defense, detailing the true history of America's involvement in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. The pages contained more than just statistics and analysis. They contained proof that the U.S. government had known the war was unwinnable, had misled the public about its progress, and had expanded military operations while publicly promising peace. The man responsible for the leak was Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst who had once supported the war but had grown disillusioned after seeing the extent of government deception. Working at the Rand Corporation, Ellsberg had access to the classified documents, and as he read through them, he realized that the American people had been systematically lied to by 4 different administrations: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, about the war's true nature. What was inside the Pentagon Papers was damning. The U.S. had meddled in Vietnam long before the conflict officially started, secretly supporting the French in their war against Ho Chi Minh. The Kennedy administration had escalated U.S. involvement, while publicly downplaying the risks, sending military advisors and covert operatives. The Johnson administration had fully committed to war, even as intelligence showed it could not be won, bombing North Vietnam while falsely promising de-escalation. The American military had routinely manipulated casualty reports to make the war appear more successful than it really was. Knowing the weight of these revelations, Ellsberg made the fateful decision to expose the truth, smuggling out copies of the report and handing them over to the New York Times. On June 13, 1971, the first installment of the Pentagon Papers was published, sending shockwaves through the country. The report proved what anti-war activists had suspected all along. Vietnam was not just a failed military operation, but an outright deception built on false promises, inflated victories, and deliberate lies fed to the American public. Government lies exposed. The Pentagon Papers confirmed that the war had never been about protecting democracy or stopping communism. It had been a political chess game, where American leaders were more concerned with saving face than saving lives. The backlash was immediate, and the government's desperate attempts to suppress the leak only made the scandal worse. Now, the truth was out, and there was no going back. Vietnam was falling apart, both abroad and at home. And soon, Nixon himself would be caught in the firestorm, leading to one of the biggest political crises in US history. With the publication of the Pentagon Papers, the US government's credibility collapsed overnight, exposing decades of deception, manipulation, and reckless escalation in Vietnam. The public now had proof that the war was never truly about democracy, never about preventing communism, but about maintaining political power, saving face, and preventing the humiliation of a failed military campaign. The revelations were devastating. Americans realized that 4 different presidential administrations had systematically lied, had knowingly prolonged a war they could not win, had sent thousands of soldiers to die in a conflict they themselves knew was unwinnable. The documents revealed how casualty numbers were manipulated, how victories were fabricated, how military decisions were made not for strategic necessity, but for political optics. President Richard Nixon, though not directly responsible for the lies exposed in the Pentagon Papers, panicked at the implications. Fearing that this leak would set a precedent for future whistleblowers, further eroding trust in the presidency and the government itself. He was enraged, not because the leak painted a false picture of the war, but because it exposed the truth he wanted to keep buried. Nixon's administration immediately took action, trying to silence the New York Times, which had published the first set of leaked documents. The government argued that the publication of these classified materials posed a grave national security threat, claiming that continued reporting on the Pentagon Papers would jeopardize military operations and risk American lives. A justification that was quickly dismantled by legal experts, who pointed out that the war's failures had already been exposed, and that the documents themselves were historical records, not present-day battle strategies. Determined to stop the leaks, Nixon's team filed a lawsuit against the New York Times, demanding an injunction to halt further publication of classified details, launching an unprecedented legal battle over press freedom, government accountability, and the right of the public to know the truth. The battle escalated to the Supreme Court, marking one of the most consequential First Amendment cases in American history. If Nixon succeeded, it would set a dangerous precedent, allowing the government to suppress journalism, to silence whistleblowers, to control what the public was allowed to learn about its leaders. The Supreme Court battle with the New York Times was not just about Vietnam. It was about the fundamental right to truth, about whether the government could erase history to protect its own power, about whether a free press could challenge authority without fear of retaliation. And as the courtroom struggle unfolded, America stood at the edge of a turning point, one that would either strengthen democracy or reveal its fragility. Vietnam was more than a war. It was now a full-scale reckoning with truth itself. And soon, the world would know whether justice would prevail. The battle between the New York Times and the US government over the Pentagon Papers became a defining moment for American democracy, a struggle that tested the limits of free speech, the power of the press, and the government's ability to suppress the truth. Nixon's administration, desperate to silence the leaks, argued that publishing classified information posed a grave threat to national security, insisting that continued exposure of government secrets would endanger soldiers, sabotage diplomatic relations, and weaken America's global standing. But in reality, the fight was not about security. It was about control, about preventing the American people from fully understanding the depth of deception behind Vietnam. The case reached the Supreme Court, where justices had to answer a fundamental question. Could the government override First Amendment protections and prevent a newspaper from publishing factual information? Nixon's team pushed hard, claiming that the leaks were reckless, dangerous, and an act of defiance against the government's authority. But journalists and legal scholars argued that the truth belonged to the people, that suppressing history, even classified history, was a violation of democratic principles. On June 30, 1971, in a landmark 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the New York Times, rejecting the government's attempt to block publication. The ruling reaffirmed the fundamental right of the press to expose government wrongdoing, even when those in power wanted to keep the truth buried. It was a victory not just for journalism, but for the very fabric of American democracy. A declaration that secrecy could not outweigh the people's right to know how their leaders operated. The leak further eroded public trust in the war, accelerating opposition, fueling protests, and strengthening voices that had long warned that Vietnam was built on lies, political deception, and reckless ambition. Among the most powerful critics of the war were leaders of the civil rights movement, figures who recognized that Vietnam was not just an unjust war overseas. It was a war that disproportionately harmed Black Americans, robbing them of opportunities at home while forcing them to fight and die for a country that still denied them full equality. MLK and Muhammad Ali vs. the war. Moral opposition from black leaders. Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali stood at the forefront of the moral battle against Vietnam, rejecting the war not just as a failed military campaign, but as an extension of the racial oppression that had plagued America for centuries. Their voices resonated across the nation, turning Vietnam into not just a political crisis, but a moral reckoning. And as their resistance grew stronger, America could no longer ignore the reality that Vietnam was deeply intertwined with its own failures at home. The Vietnam War was never just about Southeast Asia. It was about America itself, about the systemic inequalities that sent young black men into combat while denying them basic rights at home. As the war raged on, as protests grew louder, as the draft disproportionately targeted poor and minority communities, the civil rights movement could no longer ignore Vietnam's role in deepening racial injustice. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke out forcefully against the war, recognizing that Black Americans were being sent to fight and die for a government that still refused to grant them equality. In his 1967 speech, Beyond Vietnam, King condemned the conflict, calling it an imperialist war that drained resources from communities struggling with poverty, segregation, and oppression. He pointed out the hypocrisy. Why should black men be sent overseas to protect freedoms in Vietnam that they themselves did not have in America? Muhammad Ali, the world heavyweight champion, took an even bolder stance, publicly rejecting the draft, refusing to serve, and declaring that Vietnam was not his fight. His words shook the nation. "I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me a racial slur." Ali's refusal was not just an act of defiance. It was a direct challenge to America's racial double standard, exposing how black Americans were expected to sacrifice everything for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. And as his opposition solidified, the backlash came swiftly, with consequences that would change the course of his life forever. Ali's refusal to serve and the backlash. The US government stripped him of his boxing titles, banned him from fighting, and sentenced him to prison for draft evasion, turning him into one of the most controversial figures in the nation. His career, his fame, his freedom, all taken away because he dared to reject a war built on lies. But even as America punished him, Ali never backed down, standing as a symbol of resistance, refusing to be silent, refusing to submit. Vietnam was dividing the nation, and now, even its greatest champions were turning against it. And the US was losing control of the narrative. Muhammad Ali's refusal to serve in Vietnam was not just an act of defiance. It was a direct challenge to America's racial and moral hypocrisy. At the height of his career, a world champion admired across the globe, he chose principle over personal gain, rejecting the draft, rejecting the war, rejecting the very system that sought to silence his people. And for that, America turned against him. The backlash was swift, severe, and merciless. The US government stripped him of his heavyweight boxing title, barring him from the ring at the peak of his abilities. His passport was revoked, preventing him from fighting internationally. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for draft evasion, though he remained free as he appealed his case. He lost millions in earnings, endorsements, and opportunities, but he refused to back down. To Ali, Vietnam was not his war, not his fight, not his burden to bear. How could he justify traveling thousands of miles to kill people who had never oppressed him, never enslaved his ancestors, never denied him his rights, while black Americans were still lynched, brutalized, and systematically held down in their own country? The war was being fought in the name of freedom, but Ali knew that the freedoms America claimed to protect overseas were not granted to his own people at home. And when questioned about his refusal, when reporters and critics demanded an explanation, he answered with a statement that shook the nation to its core. No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word. With one sentence, Ali exposed the war for what it was, not a fight for democracy, but a political and racial contradiction. America was willing to send black men to kill and die in Vietnam, but unwilling to grant them full equality within its own borders. His words became a rallying cry, an undeniable truth that forced the country to confront its own failures. And even in exile, even banned from the sport that had made him a global icon, Ali remained undefeated, not by boxing, but by history itself. He was no soldier, but he was a warrior, fighting battles that stretched far beyond the ring. Vietnam was unraveling, and voices like his helped ensure that its illusions could never fully stand again. Muhammad Ali's words, "No Viet Cong ever called me the N-word," resonated across America, cutting through the noise of government propaganda, political rhetoric, and military justification. His stance against the war was not just about Vietnam. It was about exposing the deep contradictions within America itself, a nation that demanded black men fight for democracy overseas while denying them equality at home. His refusal to serve was not an act of cowardice, but of courage, standing firm despite losing his title. His ability to fight professionally and facing prison time for his defiance. Ali's statement became a rallying cry for anti-war activists, civil rights leaders, and young Americans growing disillusioned with the war. His refusal to be drafted wasn't just about personal principles. It symbolized a larger rejection of a corrupt system, one that sacrificed its own citizens for political ambitions. The more people listened to voices like Ali's, the more they saw through the government's lies, questioning Vietnam, questioning the draft, questioning the very nature of America's involvement. The war was no longer just unpopular. It was collapsing under the weight of its own failures. And then, in 1968, the illusion of victory shattered completely, with a surprise assault that tore through American defenses, proving that the war was far from being won. A DADLYXIT, the Tet Offensive, a turning point of perception. Under the cover of a ceasefire, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year celebration, the Viet Cong launched one of the most shocking attacks of the entire war, hitting over 100 cities and US military bases simultaneously. It was a strike no one saw coming, and its impact would permanently change how America viewed Vietnam. The battlefield was no longer controlled by the US. It was unraveling, and the world was about to see that Vietnam was far from over. The war was on borrowed time, and after Tet, there was no turning back. The Tet Offensive, launched on January 30, 1968, was the moment the Vietnam War changed forever. For years, the US military had assured the American public that the war was under control. That victory was inevitable, that the enemy was weakening. Then, in a single night, all those assurances were shattered. Under the cover of the Lunar New Year ceasefire, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces executed a massive, coordinated assault across South Vietnam, striking over 100 cities, military bases, and government strongholds simultaneously. The attack was precise, calculated, and devastating, catching US and South Vietnamese forces completely off guard. The enemy broke through fortified defenses, stormed the US embassy in Saigon, and turned city streets into battlefields, proving that they were not beaten, not retreating, and not on the verge of collapse. Quite the opposite. They were stronger than ever. American soldiers fought desperately, reclaiming control, pushing back the attackers, inflicting heavy casualties. From a purely military standpoint, the US emerged victorious. The Viet Cong suffered enormous losses, their forces depleted, their ability to wage large-scale attacks severely weakened. But strategically, the damage had already been done. For the first time, American leaders could no longer hide the truth from the public. The war was not close to victory. It was spiraling out of control. Cities once believed to be secure had fallen. American forces had been blindsided, and the enemy had launched one of the most daring operations in modern warfare. Television cameras captured the carnage in real time, broadcasting images of desperate firefights, civilians caught in the crossfire, soldiers retreating under heavy fire. Proof that the war's optimistic narrative was nothing but an illusion. The Tet Offensive was a psychological disaster for the US, not because of battlefield losses, but because it shattered the American public's trust in the war effort. US military wins tactically, but loses psychologically. The battle was won on the ground, but lost in the hearts and minds of the people. Vietnam was no longer just an unpopular war. It was now an unwinnable war. And after Tet, the countdown to withdrawal had begun. The illusion had finally collapsed, and soon, Washington would have no choice but to face the truth. The Tet Offensive had rattled the foundations of America's confidence in the Vietnam War. Although the US military ultimately repelled the attack and inflicted heavy casualties on the Viet Cong, the psychological damage was irreversible. The war was no longer seen as a series of gradual victories. It was exposed for what it truly was: a prolonged, bloody conflict with no end in sight. Washington had spent years assuring the public that progress was being made, that the enemy was weakening, that US forces were on the brink of success. But Tet changed everything. The idea that the North Vietnamese could launch such a massive, coordinated strike, penetrating Saigon, storming the US embassy, attacking over 100 locations in a single night, proved that the war was far from over, that the enemy was far from defeated. Public faith collapsed almost instantly. American families who had watched news reports showing body counts, jungle warfare, and villages burned to the ground had been told by officials to trust the military's strategy. But now, that trust was gone. Tet had broken the illusion, leaving only the raw truth. Vietnam was not winnable in the way Washington had promised. And then came Walter Cronkite, America's most trusted news anchor. Up until now, reporters had covered Vietnam with neutrality, presenting footage of combat, describing casualty numbers, and broadcasting updates from the front lines, but never directly questioning the war's purpose. But after Tet, Cronkite did something unprecedented. He spoke not just as a reporter, but as a voice for the growing frustration gripping the nation. In a rare editorial segment, Cronkite looked into the camera and delivered a verdict that would shake the country's confidence even further. It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. He told viewers, "To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only reasonable, yet unsatisfactory conclusion." Cronkite, the man America trusted more than any politician, more than any general, more than any president, had declared the war unwinnable. Walter Cronkite declares the war unwinnable. His words echoed across the country, convincing millions of Americans that Vietnam had no real future. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson, upon hearing Cronkite's statement, reportedly told aides, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Vietnam was no longer just unpopular, it was crumbling under the weight of its own failures. And soon, Washington would be forced to make decisions it had spent years avoiding. The countdown to withdrawal had begun. Walter Cronkite's declaration that Vietnam was unwinnable sent shockwaves across America, marking a moment where even the most trusted voices in journalism had turned against the war. His words carried more weight than any protest, any speech, any political debate. They confirmed that Vietnam was not a matter of victory or strategy anymore, but survival and exit. President Lyndon B. Johnson, already facing declining support, knew the war was lost, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of Americans. Just weeks after Cronkite's statement, Johnson made a stunning announcement. He would not seek re-election, acknowledging that his presidency had been consumed by Vietnam, that the war had drained his political strength, that no amount of speeches, promises, or military campaigns could restore confidence. Vietnam had broken his administration, and now the war's future was in the hands of his successor. In 1969, Richard Nixon took office, inheriting a conflict America was desperate to escape. Nixon had campaigned on a promise to bring peace with honor, pledging to end U.S. involvement in Vietnam without conceding defeat. His strategy was called Vietnamization, a plan to gradually withdraw American troops while strengthening South Vietnamese forces, allowing them to take over the fight. The goal was to make South Vietnam self-sufficient so the U.S. could exit without humiliation. But behind this public strategy, Nixon had a different, darker plan unfolding. As Nixon began pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam, he also expanded the war in secret, launching covert bombing campaigns in Cambodia and Laos, targeting suspected Viet Cong supply routes and hiding places. These bombings were never authorized by Congress, never revealed to the American public, and never formally acknowledged until years later. Nixon and Vietnamization. Secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos. Instead of de-escalating, Nixon widened the destruction, ordering massive airstrikes that devastated villages, killing thousands, creating one of the largest refugee crises in Southeast Asian history. Vietnam was no longer just Vietnam. It was spreading, consuming nations that had never been officially part of the war. And, while Nixon claimed he was ending U.S. involvement, the reality was that he was dragging America deeper into chaos. Soon, the truth of his secret war would be exposed, and the backlash would push the anti-war movement into its most explosive phase yet. Vietnam was spiraling toward its final reckoning. Nixon's presidency marked a contradiction that defined the final years of the Vietnam War. He came into office promising to end U.S. involvement, but instead expanded the conflict into neighboring countries, dragging America deeper into destruction while assuring the public that withdrawal was near. This strategy, known as Vietnamization, was meant to shift the burden of fighting from American troops to the South Vietnamese army, allowing the US to gradually pull out. But behind this policy, a secret war was unfolding, one that would lead to devastating consequences. Believing that North Vietnamese forces were using Cambodia and Laos as supply routes and safe havens, Nixon authorized massive, covert bombings of these nations, bombings that were never officially declared, never approved by Congress, and never revealed to the American people. The airstrikes were relentless, destroying villages, killing thousands, and turning entire regions into wastelands of craters and smoke. Though these bombings were meant to weaken the Viet Cong, they instead sparked further instability, helping fuel civil wars in Cambodia and Laos and deepening global outrage against the US. At home, Americans still believed Nixon was working toward peace, unaware that behind the scenes, the war was spreading rather than shrinking. The secrecy surrounding these bombings only added to the growing distrust of the government, especially as more reports leaked about Nixon's true military operations. What had begun as a mission to de-escalate was rapidly becoming a full-scale expansion, making Vietnam even more dangerous, even more politically fragile, even more impossible to win. Expanding the war while promising to end it, Nixon stood before the nation and spoke of peace, of withdrawal, of victory without shame. But behind closed doors, his administration was setting Southeast Asia ablaze with covert operations. Vietnam was no longer just a battle between North and South. It was now a war that threatened an entire region, spiraling toward a breaking point that could no longer be hidden from the American public. And soon, the weight of Nixon's contradictions would collapse under its own deception. Vietnam was not ending. It was unraveling faster than Washington could control. Nixon's strategy for Vietnam was built on contradictions, carefully crafted to maintain public support while secretly deepening America's military involvement. To the public, he spoke of withdrawal, of bringing US soldiers home, of ending the war without disgrace. But behind closed doors, his administration continued airstrikes, expanded combat zones, and fueled new conflicts in Cambodia and Laos, all while insisting that peace was within reach. The policy of Vietnamization, handing control over to South Vietnamese forces while gradually pulling out American troops, was meant to convince Americans that the war was stabilizing. But in reality, Nixon was gambling with military escalation, hoping that more bombings, more covert operations, and more pressure on North Vietnam would force a negotiated peace on America's terms. His secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos deepened global outrage, sparking resistance both abroad and at home. As evidence of his secret war leaked into the press, protest movements surged, with demonstrations turning violent, campuses erupting in rebellion, and faith in the presidency falling to new lows. Nixon insisted that his approach would lead to peace with honor, a resolution where the US could leave Vietnam without admitting defeat, ensuring that South Vietnam could hold its own against communism. But with each passing month, with each new revelation of secret operations, with every fresh casualty report, it became harder to believe that victory, any form of it, was still possible. Peace with honor or just delaying collapse? Was Nixon truly working toward an honorable exit? Or was he simply prolonging the inevitable, dragging out the war to save political face? To avoid admitting that Vietnam was a mistake from the very beginning. The longer he stalled, the more soldiers died, the more protests erupted, the more the war turned into a symbol of America's greatest failure. And soon, the moment Nixon feared most would arrive, a reckoning that could no longer be avoided. Vietnam was heading toward its final, brutal conclusion. Nixon's promise of peace with honor was built on an illusion, an attempt to exit Vietnam without admitting defeat, without acknowledging that the war had been a tragic mistake from the beginning. His strategy, Vietnamization, had sought to transfer responsibility to South Vietnamese forces, allowing the US to withdraw while maintaining the fragile illusion of victory. But beneath this political rhetoric, the reality was clear. America's involvement was ending not because it had won, but because it could no longer justify staying. The war's final years were defined by desperate attempts to salvage what was left. From secret bombings in Cambodia and Laos to propping up a South Vietnamese government that was rapidly losing control. Nixon's administration negotiated ceasefires, engaged in peace talks, and withdrew troops. But every move only delayed the inevitable. As American forces continued pulling out, the cracks in South Vietnam's defenses grew wider, and it became only a matter of time before collapse arrived in full force. In 1973, the US officially ended its direct military involvement with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, a moment meant to mark a dignified end to the war. But peace was never truly secured. The North Vietnamese had no intention of stopping their campaign, and South Vietnam was left with an army unprepared to stand on its own. Over the next 2 years, city after city fell, and by early 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, stood on the edge of disaster. The US government had promised South Vietnam its continued support. But when the final North Vietnamese offensive began, it became clear that Washington would not intervene. The reality was undeniable. Vietnam was lost, and all that remained was a chaotic, desperate evacuation. The fall of Saigon, helicopters lifting off embassy rooftops. On April 30, 1975, the world watched as Saigon collapsed, with panicked South Vietnamese citizens scrambling to flee, racing toward the last remaining helicopters, clutching onto anything that might get them out before North Vietnamese forces took control. On the rooftops of the US Embassy, desperate civilians, American personnel, and South Vietnamese allies packed into helicopters. Knowing this was their only chance to escape. Vietnam had finally fallen, and for America, it was a bitter, humiliating end to a war that had claimed far too much. As the last helicopters lifted off, the long, bloody nightmare of Vietnam was finally over. But its scars would last for generations. And in its wake, the questions of morality, deception, and betrayal would remain unanswered. Vietnam was over, but its ghosts were only beginning to haunt history. On April 30, 1975, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell, marking the definitive, catastrophic end of the Vietnam War. The once thriving city descended into panic, its streets overflowing with desperate civilians, begging for escape, while North Vietnamese forces closed in, preparing to take full control. The last remnants of the American military scrambled to evacuate, ushering personnel, diplomats, and South Vietnamese allies onto the final helicopters, lifting off from the US Embassy's rooftop, knowing that once the doors shut, there would be no second chances. Footage of those helicopters, crammed with passengers, hovering above a city on the brink of collapse. The last tangible sign of America's presence in Vietnam. became one of the war's most haunting images. It was not a victory, not an honorable exit, not the peace Nixon had promised. It was a retreat. A desperate attempt to flee before Saigon was swallowed entirely by the advancing communist forces. Outside the embassy gates, thousands of South Vietnamese citizens pleaded for rescue, banging on the locked iron barriers, shouting, crying, trying to climb over the walls in a final attempt to reach safety. But there was no room left, no space on the last departing aircraft, no way to stop the inevitable. As the final helicopter disappeared into the horizon, Saigon's fate was sealed. South Vietnam crumbles in chaos. In the aftermath, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets, storming government buildings, ripping down South Vietnam's flag, replacing it with the banner of the communist forces. The South Vietnamese military collapsed entirely. Soldiers abandoned their posts, fled into hiding, or surrendered without resistance. For the civilians left behind, the future was uncertain, and fear became the only certainty. Vietnam was no longer divided. It was now fully under communist rule, and for thousands of former allies of the US, there would be no mercy, only retribution. The war was over. But for many, the nightmare was only just beginning. And for America, the scars of Vietnam would linger long after the last helicopter had vanished from the sky. Saigon had fallen, and with it, South Vietnam ceased to exist. The government collapsed almost instantly, its leaders fleeing or surrendering, its military dissolving into chaos, and its civilians left to face the terrifying reality of communist rule. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the streets, flags were torn down, embassies were abandoned, and entire neighborhoods turned into ghost towns as fear gripped the city like never before. Soldiers who had once fought for South Vietnam disappeared, some going into hiding, some attempting to flee, and others accepting their fate, knowing that the victors would show no mercy. But the true cost of South Vietnam's collapse was paid by its people. Those who had worked with the US government, officials, translators, soldiers, civilians who had supported the American effort, were suddenly enemies of the state. They knew what was coming: revenge, retribution, imprisonment, death. Thousands rushed to escape, crowding the airports, swarming the docks, trying to find any means of fleeing before North Vietnamese forces fully consolidated power. Some made it onto US helicopters, escaping to America, leaving behind their homes, their families, their pasts, forced into exile in a country they had never meant to call home. Others were abandoned, left to face the harsh reality of communist victory. And once Saigon was fully secured, the new government began its purge. Refugees, re-education camps, and silence. Those who had fought against communism, those who had aided the US, those suspected of anti-government sentiment, were rounded up, imprisoned, and sent to re-education camps. Here, they were stripped of their identities, forced into brutal labor, subjected to endless indoctrination, and made to suffer for their past allegiance to the fallen South. For many, these camps were death sentences, places where starvation, disease, and execution were routine. For others, escape was their only option, becoming boat people, launching desperate, perilous journeys across the ocean, seeking refuge in countries that might offer them a second chance. And for those who remained, life under communist rule meant silence, accepting the new reality, burying the past, and knowing that history had already chosen its victors. Vietnam had changed forever, and for those who had lost everything, there was no going back, only survival, only exile, only the memory of what had once been, and what had been destroyed. The Vietnam War did not simply end when the last American helicopters lifted off Saigon's rooftops. It lingered in the ruins of lost cities, in the suffering of displaced refugees, in the haunted memories of those left behind, and in the broken minds of those who had fought it. For thousands of South Vietnamese citizens who had once allied with the United States, the fall of Saigon meant persecution, imprisonment, and exile. The new communist regime wasted no time consolidating power, branding former South Vietnamese officials, military personnel, and political opponents as threats to the revolution. These individuals were rounded up and sent to re-education camps, where they were subjected to harsh conditions, grueling labor, forced ideological indoctrination, and endless psychological torment. The regime promised that the camps would rehabilitate those with imperialist loyalties, but in reality, they were prisons without end, places where prisoners faced starvation, disease, and execution. Many died in captivity, while others endured years of torment before finally being released, only to return to a country where their past affiliations marked them forever. For those unwilling to suffer under communist rule, escape was the only option. Entire families fled on overcrowded boats, risking death on the open sea in hopes of finding refuge in foreign lands. Known as boat people, these refugees faced starvation, violent storms, and attacks by pirates, all for a chance at freedom. Some were rescued, some found new homes in the US, Australia, and France, but others disappeared into the ocean, their fates never known. Vietnam's war had left wounds that could never fully heal. The country was unified, but at the cost of its own people's suffering, and far across the ocean. American veterans who had fought in Vietnam were beginning their own battle, one that would never truly end. PTSD and a broken generation for the soldiers who had survived Vietnam. Returning home was not the triumphant reunion they had been promised. Unlike World War II veterans, who had been welcomed as heroes, Vietnam veterans came back to hostility, judgment, and neglect. Protests against the war were at their peak, and for many Americans, Vietnam was not seen as an honorable conflict. It was seen as a mistake, a disaster, a stain on the country's history. Soldiers who had spent years fighting in the jungles, watching their friends die, living in constant terror, and enduring the horrors of war, returned not to celebration, but to accusations. They were called baby killers, murderers, pawns of a corrupt government. Some were spit on in the streets, others were rejected by employers, and many felt abandoned. Lost in a country that no longer understood them. But beyond the social backlash, the war had damaged them in deeper ways. PTSD, though not officially recognized yet, was consuming Vietnam veterans at alarming rates. They suffered from nightmares that made sleep unbearable, flashbacks that made peace impossible, paranoia that turned everyday life into a battlefield, addiction to drugs and alcohol, trying to silence the ghosts of war. Many could not reconnect with their families, unable to explain what they had endured, what they had seen, who they had become. Suicide rates skyrocketed, homelessness became a crisis, and veterans who had once dreamed of returning to normal life realized that Vietnam had followed them home. And it was never going to leave. For America, Vietnam was over. For those who had fought it, Vietnam was forever. And even decades later, the scars of the war remained, buried deep in history, deep in memory, deep in those who had survived a conflict that never should have happened. The war was lost, but its consequences would never truly be buried. Vietnam had broken a generation, and in many ways, it had broken America itself. Vietnam veterans did not return home as heroes. They returned as ghosts, trapped between the war they had left behind and a country that no longer welcomed them. Unlike the soldiers of World War II, who were greeted with parades, job opportunities, and national pride, Vietnam veterans stepped off planes into silence, resentment, and outright hostility. The war had been unpopular, and now that it was over, many Americans wanted to forget it entirely. But for the soldiers who had fought through the jungles, survived ambushes, watched their friends die, endured years of bloodshed and fear, forgetting was never an option. They carried Vietnam inside them, in memories they couldn't escape, in wounds that never fully healed, in nightmares that replayed the horrors long after the war had ended. As protests against Vietnam still lingered in the air, some veterans were spat on, called murderers, rejected from jobs, treated as symbols of a war that had failed. Others simply faded into obscurity, struggling to reintegrate into a world that no longer understood them. The war had changed them, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. But instead of care, support, or even acknowledgement, many were left to suffer alone. Without proper treatment, without guidance, without anyone to help them process the trauma of Vietnam, many veterans collapsed under the weight of their own minds, leading to an epidemic that America had never seen before on this scale. Homelessness, mental illness, and suicide. Veterans who had once fought for survival in war zones were now fighting for survival in their own country, battling poverty, addiction, untreated PTSD, and depression. Many couldn't hold jobs, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't find peace in a society that refused to acknowledge their suffering. Homelessness skyrocketed, with thousands of veterans sleeping on the streets, forgotten by the very nation they had risked their lives to defend. Suicides became tragically common, as many soldiers felt there was no escape from the war still raging in their minds. The Vietnam War did not just destroy lives overseas, it continued destroying them long after it was over. The soldiers who had survived the battlefield were now facing their final war at home. And for many, it was a war they would not win. Vietnam veterans did not just return home to a divided nation. Many returned to a personal war that never truly ended. The conflict may have been over in the jungles, but inside their minds, Vietnam was still raging, still clawing at them, still dragging them back into the nightmares they could never escape. For thousands of veterans, adjusting to civilian life proved impossible. The traumas they had witnessed, the horrors they had endured, were never processed, never acknowledged, never treated. PTSD, though not officially recognized as a medical condition at the time, sank its teeth deep into their souls, leaving them unable to sleep, unable to function, unable to find peace in the country they had fought for. Many turned to alcohol and drugs, desperately searching for ways to drown out the voices, the memories, the images of war that refused to fade. With little support from the government, with few resources available to help them reintegrate into society, thousands of veterans slipped through the cracks, forgotten, abandoned, discarded. Homelessness, mental illness, and suicide. America had sent them to fight, but when they returned, it did not fight for them. Cities became filled with homeless veterans, sleeping under bridges, wandering aimlessly, struggling to survive. Their minds were shattered, their bodies worn down, their spirits broken by a country that had promised them honor, but left them in isolation. Suicide rates among Vietnam veterans skyrocketed, as many saw no way out, no future, no hope, no escape from the war that had followed them home. For them, Vietnam did not end in 1975. It lingered, haunted them, consumed them piece by piece. And as America tried to move forward, to forget, to bury Vietnam in history, the voices of the fallen, and the suffering needed a place to be remembered. A memorial, not for victory, not for politics, but for grief, for loss, for those who had given everything, whether they had returned or not. Vietnam Veterans Memorial, black granite, black grief. A wall of names etched into stone, reflecting back at visitors as they walked the length of the grief carved into its surface. No grand statues, no glorified symbols, just names, a sea of them, stretching endlessly, telling the story of those who were lost. America had abandoned many of its veterans, but here, at the black granite wall, they could not be ignored. Here, their sacrifice was undeniable. Here, Vietnam lived on, not in war, but in memory, in mourning, in the silence of a country forced to confront its past. And in that silence, the ghosts of Vietnam whispered their final truth. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial stands in stark contrast to the wars America had glorified before. No statues, no triumphant symbolism, just black granite, stretching in silence, holding the names of those who never returned. The design is almost funeral, like a wall that descends into the earth, as though sinking under the weight of the war's consequences, of its grief, of its unbearable losses. Visitors walk its length, running fingers over the etched names, searching for lost brothers, lost fathers, lost friends. The black stone reflects their faces, merging them with the fallen, a haunting reminder that Vietnam never truly ended. It simply left scars that refused to heal. And for those who survived, the war did not leave them untouched. Even decades later, its remnants still haunt them, not just in memory, but in their bodies, in their blood, in their very DNA. The war may have ended in 1975, but something far more insidious remained behind. A poison that seeped into the land, into the rivers, into the people. Agent Orange and the poisoned land. The US military had sprayed millions of gallons of Agent Orange across Vietnam. A powerful chemical meant to strip away jungle cover, to expose enemy troops and disrupt their movements. But it did far more than destroy forests. It poisoned everything it touched. Vietnamese civilians, American soldiers, generations yet unborn would suffer the consequences, developing cancer, birth defects, neurological disorders, all caused by exposure to the toxic defoliant. The war may have ended, but Agent Orange never left, and its victims, on both sides, would carry its legacy in their bodies for the rest of their lives. Vietnam was not just a war fought with bullets, but with chemicals, with devastation that could never be undone. And even now, the land itself still bears the scars. The war may have ended, but Vietnam's suffering did not stop. When the last American troops left, the jungles had been burned away, rivers and farmland contaminated, and entire communities exposed to something far worse than bombs or bullets. A silent killer that would haunt generations. Agent Orange, a chemical defoliant used by the US military to strip away Vietnam's dense foliage, was meant to clear the landscape, expose enemy hideouts, and cripple supply routes. But no one fully understood or cared to acknowledge what it would do to the people who lived on that land, breathed in that air, and drank that water. During the war, millions of gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed over the countryside, covering crops, forests, villages, military bases. The toxic dioxin seeped into the soil, into the water, into the bodies of those who lived there, both Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers alike. And though the war was over, the poison remained, waiting to unleash its horrors in ways few could have imagined. Birth defects, cancers, environmental devastation. Children were born with twisted limbs, missing eyes, malformed skulls, generations suffering from the lasting genetic damage of exposure to Agent Orange. Vietnamese villages, once thriving, became centers of sickness, filled with families, watching helplessly as their loved ones fell to rare, aggressive cancers, neurological disorders, respiratory diseases. American veterans who had fought in Vietnam returned home with symptoms they could not explain. Skin rashes, organ failure, unexplained tumors, their bodies slowly betraying them decades after the war had ended. And the land itself, once lush with life, remained scarred, contaminated, stripped of its natural balance, with entire ecosystems destroyed beyond repair. Agent Orange did not just kill. It lingered, it spread, it passed through bloodlines, ensuring that Vietnam's suffering would stretch far beyond the battlefield. The war may have faded into history, but its poison still lived on, undeniable, unerasable, unforgettable. And for those who bore its consequences, Vietnam was never truly over. Not in their bodies, not in their families, not in the land that had once given them life. The aftermath of Agent Orange was more than just the lingering poison. It was generations of suffering, bodies twisted by exposure, lives cut short by disease, an environment forever altered by the war's reckless destruction. The chemical did not discriminate. It seeped into the land, into the water, into the people, leaving behind a legacy etched into DNA, medical records, and graves. The effects of Agent Orange stretched far beyond Vietnam, following American soldiers home, attacking them decades after they left the battlefield. Some developed aggressive cancers, their immune systems failing against the toxins still buried within them. Others watched their children suffer birth defects, victims of a war they had never fought. No battle, no ceasefire, no treaty could undo what had already been done. The US government at first denied responsibility, dismissing veterans' claims, rejecting scientific evidence, refusing to acknowledge that their own troops had been poisoned by their own war tactics. Meanwhile, Vietnam remained scarred, entire villages marked by the lasting presence of the chemical. Fields once lush never fully recovered, jungles stripped bare never returned to their former glory. Rivers filled with toxins could not bring life back to the people who relied on them. For those born after the war, Vietnam was not just history. It was a curse passed down by those who had lived through it. And while the effects of Agent Orange stretched on, the war itself had already claimed its final toll. The numbers, cold and undeniable, etched into memorials, into documents, into the memories of those who had lost everything. The cost in numbers and souls, 58,000 American dead. Vietnam had stolen lives, futures, generations, entire communities, leaving behind not just a battlefield, but an entire war-torn legacy that refused to be erased. For America, the war meant 58,000 fallen soldiers, their names engraved in the dark granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Each name a story, a sacrifice, a life that never saw peace. For Vietnam, the cost was even greater. Millions dead, countless more wounded. A country reshaped by destruction, still recovering decades later. The war had been fought for political ambition, for illusions of victory, for decisions made far from the jungles and villages that suffered the consequences. And in the end, no flag, no speech, no justification could redeem what had been lost. Vietnam was over, but its ghosts would remain, whispering in the silence left behind. The Vietnam War was not just a military conflict, it was a human catastrophe, leaving behind a staggering toll that would haunt history forever. For America, the price of intervention was measured in blood, in loss, in broken families with 58,000 soldiers dead, their names now etched into the black granite of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Each one a life cut short, a future erased, a sacrifice weighed against a war that was never meant to be won. But while America mourned its fallen, Vietnam's losses were even more devastating, even more overwhelming, even more irreversible. The war had stretched across 2 decades, consuming towns, cities, jungles, turning homes into battlefields, transforming lives into collateral damage. The cost was not just in soldiers, but in civilians, men, women, children caught in the crossfire, dying in bombings, massacres, starvation, chemical exposure, and endless violence. By the time the war ended, Vietnam had lost over 2 million lives, a number so vast it could never fully be comprehended, a tragedy so immense that no victory, no political justification, no ideological stance could ever make it right. Over 2 million Vietnamese dead. Entire villages wiped out. Generations erased before they had a chance to live. Families torn apart by a war they never asked for. For some, death came in an instant. A bullet, a bomb, a raid. For others, it came slowly. Starvation, sickness. The poison of Agent Orange passed down through bloodlines, infecting even those born after the war had ended. Vietnam was rebuilt, but it was never the same. And for those who survived, the war never truly ended. It lived in memory, in grief, in silence, in the spaces left behind by the millions who never made it home. History could count the dead, but it would never be able to measure the depth of the suffering left in Vietnam's wake. And the world would never forget what was lost, nor what could never be reclaimed. The Vietnam War was not just a tragedy counted in body bags. It was a disaster that reshaped the lives of millions, uprooting families, tearing communities apart, and erasing entire ways of life. The death toll had climbed past 2 million, but the suffering extended far beyond those who had lost their lives. Entire villages were burned, bombed, and erased from existence, forcing survivors to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the lingering fear that nowhere would ever be safe again. Families were fragmented, loved ones scattered across borders, displaced in unfamiliar lands, never knowing if they would be reunited. For those who remained in Vietnam, the war meant political persecution, forced labor, indoctrination, and a new regime that was determined to erase everything tied to the South. Traditional practices faded, cultural identities were rewritten, and generations grew up under a government that demanded loyalty, but offered little healing from the wounds left behind. And for the refugees, the boat people, the exiles, those who had escaped at the last possible moment, the war did not end when they fled Vietnam. They carried its weight with them, settling in foreign countries, learning new languages, struggling to rebuild their lives while grieving for everything they had lost. Millions displaced, cultures shattered, entire populations ripped away from their homeland, never able to return, memories of Vietnam frozen in time, existing only in stories told to children who would never know the land their parents had once called home. A war that had claimed not just bodies, but identities, traditions, and generations yet to come. Vietnam was no longer the country it had been before the war. It had become something unrecognizable, shaped by loss, shaped by survival, shaped by a history that could never be undone. And in that history, the echoes of those displaced still lingered, searching for the home they had left behind, but could never reclaim. Vietnam's destruction was not confined to its battlefields. It stretched across borders, across lives, across generations, leaving millions displaced, wandering, searching for a sense of home they could never find again. Cities had fallen. Villages had been wiped from existence. Families had been torn apart and scattered. And entire cultures had been permanently altered. The war did not just claim lives. It erased traditions, silenced histories, and forced people to abandon everything they had ever known. for the refugees, the boat people, the exiled, the ones who had fled on the last helicopters, on overcrowded ships, on desperate journeys that offered no certainty. Vietnam was not just a lost country, it was a lost past. Many never returned. Some rebuilt their lives in foreign lands, carrying Vietnam in stories, in memories, in fragments of identity they could never fully reclaim. And for those who stayed behind, survival meant submission, adjusting to a new reality where history was rewritten by the victors, where South Vietnam was erased, denied, made into something that only existed in whispers among those who remembered. Vietnam was changed forever. But for what purpose? Hoa No D1. Reflections on futility. The Vietnam War ended with no victors, only survivors, only casualties, only broken promises and shattered illusions. America had lost 58,000 lives, spent billions, drained its military, and watched as the country it fought to protect crumbled anyway. Vietnam had lost millions, entire generations stolen, its land poisoned, its people displaced, its future permanently scarred. And for what? A war that never needed to happen, a war that served no true purpose, a war that broke more than it ever built. Even today, Vietnam remains a ghost in America's history, a lesson unlearned, a failure acknowledged but never fully reckoned with. What was it all for? A question without an answer. Only the weight of all that was lost, all that was wasted, all that could never be undone. Vietnam was over, but its futility would never fade, and in that futility, the true cost of war was laid bare. Reflections on futility. What was it all for? The Vietnam War left behind scars that could never fully heal, wounds that stretched across nations, across generations, across history itself. For America, it was a war fought not for conquest, not for immediate survival, but for ideology, for a belief in stopping communism at any cost, even when the cost was immeasurable. Vietnam was supposed to be a chess piece in the Cold War, a battleground where the US could prove its dominance, its commitment to democracy, its refusal to let any nation slip into the hands of its political enemies. But in reality, Vietnam became a graveyard for American ambition, a war fought in jungles the US never truly understood, against an enemy it could never fully defeat, for a victory that was never truly possible. Millions dead, billions spent, cities erased, families shattered. And for what? South Vietnam collapsed anyway. Communism prevailed despite America's intervention, and in the end, all that remained were the ghosts of those sacrificed for a conflict that was never meant to be won. And yet, the war was never just about Vietnam. It was about the Cold War itself, about America's fear that if it lost Vietnam, it would lose everything. Cold War logic versus human cost. Was it truly worth it, spending decades fighting a war that only deepened suffering, only prolonged defeat, only fueled more chaos? America claimed it was defending freedom, but in the process, it trampled on the very lives it sought to protect. Vietnam was not just a military failure, it was a moral reckoning, a moment where the world saw what happened when ideology outweighed human lives. And as the Cold War raged on, America had to ask itself, was this how wars should be fought? Was this what victory looked like? Vietnam answered those questions, not with words, but with blood. And history would never forget the cost. The Vietnam War was not just about Vietnam. It was about America's obsession with containment, its fear that communism would spread unchecked, its determination to prove its dominance in a global ideological battle. The war was never meant to be just a military engagement. It was a statement, an assertion of strength, a declaration that the US would not allow another country to fall into the hands of its enemies. But what did that ideology truly cost? The US sent over 500,000 troops, spent billions of dollars, dropped more bombs than had been used in World War II, sprayed millions of gallons of chemical defoliants, and orchestrated covert operations in neighboring countries, all in the name of stopping communism. Yet, despite all its efforts, Vietnam fell anyway. The war did not prevent communism, it deepened its resolve. The US did not prove its strength, it exposed its vulnerabilities. The battle was not won, it was abandoned. And the price? Millions dead, countless wounded, generations affected by the psychological and physical devastation left behind. The war was never truly about Vietnam. It was about America's place in the Cold War, about maintaining global power, about refusing to admit that some battles were never meant to be fought in the first place. And as time passed, as history settled, as wounds remained unhealed, Vietnam became something more than just a failed war. It became a haunting presence, a reminder of a reckoning that could never fully be erased. Vietnam as America's historical ghost. It lingers in policy decisions, in veterans' stories, in the memorials carved into stone. It is a lesson unlearned, a warning unheeded, a spectre that returns whenever the US debates intervention, war, occupation. Vietnam did not just end, it embedded itself into the national psyche. And even now, decades later, its shadow refuses to fade. It remains a ghost of past ambitions, a whisper of past mistakes, a reminder that some wars leave wounds far deeper than victory or defeat. Vietnam was never just a conflict. It became a reflection of America itself, and its echoes still shape the choices made today. Vietnam's presence in American history is not just found in textbooks, memorials, or the minds of veterans who lived through it. It lingers in foreign policy decisions, in every debate over military intervention, in the hesitation that follows each conflict that threatens to repeat the past. It is the war that should have taught restraint, caution, and humility. It should have been a lesson in the dangers of waging battle against an elusive enemy in unfamiliar terrain, for objectives that were never clearly defined. It should have marked the end of reckless intervention, the beginning of a new approach to global conflict, but instead, its warnings went ignored. The same mistakes, the same illusions, the same overconfidence would rise again in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just like Vietnam, America entered those wars with grand ambitions, promising swift victories, calculated strategies, and lasting stability. And just like Vietnam, those wars became grinding conflicts with no clear exit, with insurgencies that adapted, with objectives that shifted endlessly until the only goal left was survival and withdrawal. Once again, the world watched as American forces fought not just against an enemy, but against the limitations of their own mission, as military victories turned into political defeats, as the promise of a quick resolution unraveled into years of bloodshed. The streets of Baghdad and Kabul echoed Saigon, the desperate evacuations, the broken promises, the realization that the very forces the US had spent years trying to build were crumbling the moment American troops left. Vietnam had been the ghost that should have haunted America's every decision, and yet, it was only when helicopters lifted off Afghan rooftops, when the last American forces scrambled to escape another unwinnable war, that the comparisons could no longer be ignored. Vietnam had never truly left. Its mistakes had only been repeated under different banners, in different deserts, with different enemies. And even now, its legacy is still shaping history, still forcing America to confront the question it has never fully answered. Was the lesson ever truly learned, or was it merely postponed? The lessons of Vietnam should have been clear wars fought without clear objectives, against elusive enemies, on unfamiliar terrain. With governments propped up by American aid rather than organic legitimacy, were bound to end in disaster. But decades later, those lessons were ignored, repackaged under new strategies and fresh rhetoric, as the United States plunged into Iraq and Afghanistan. Just like Vietnam, these wars began with overwhelming confidence. Assured military superiority, promises of quick victories, talk of bringing stability to regions fractured by conflict. And just like Vietnam, those victories never materialized, morphing instead into drawn-out occupations, insurgencies adapting faster than American forces could counter, battlefields shifting unpredictably until strategy became survival. The US deployed its vast arsenal, its advanced weaponry, its intelligence networks, believing firepower and technology could win wars that history had proven unwinnable. But as Iraq descended into chaos, as Afghanistan became a battleground that no amount of drone strikes or troop surges could control, the illusion shattered again. Vietnam had been the first warning, and now history was repeating itself. America was discovering, once more, that superior firepower could devastate cities, but could not secure lasting control. That governments propped up by military intervention collapsed the moment that intervention ended. That no amount of tactics could undo the fundamental truth that some wars could never be won the way they were imagined. And as the final troops withdrew from Afghanistan, as helicopters lifted off rooftops in an eerie mirror of Saigon's last hours, the cycle was complete. The lessons were forgotten, only to be relearned in blood, in retreat, in the painful realization that the ghosts of Vietnam had never truly left. The limits of firepower had been exposed yet again. History's most brutal reminder that war was not just about force, but about the illusion of control that always crumbled under reality. Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, 3 wars fought with superior firepower, overwhelming technology, strategic intelligence, and the belief that sheer force could crush resistance, shape nations, and dictate the future. But war is rarely won by weaponry alone. Bombs leveled cities, airstrikes shattered landscapes, but control never truly materialized. The illusion was always temporary. In Vietnam, the US assumed its military dominance would overpower guerrilla fighters, until those same fighters adapted, navigating the jungles better than American troops ever could, turning the terrain itself into a weapon. In Iraq, initial shock and awe tactics convinced Washington that victory was near, until insurgents learned to blend into civilian populations, shifting battlefields into chaotic urban warfare, beyond the reach of conventional strategy. In Afghanistan, drones patrolled the skies, but the conflict was never decided by air superiority. It was determined by the resilience of a nation that had repelled foreign invaders for centuries, a history America never fully reckoned with. Time and time again, wars were waged under the assumption that overwhelming firepower could translate into control. But control proved to be an illusion. No matter how advanced the weapons, no matter how precise the strikes, nations remained unpredictable, people remained defiant, and the ground itself became hostile to any foreign force that sought to shape it through force alone. And at the heart of every failure was the same mistake: entering wars without truly understanding the people being fought, the cultures being disrupted, the histories being ignored. Military might alone never determined victory, because victory was never just about battles. It was about understanding the land, the people, the resistance that was never simply about ideology, but about identity, survival, and history. Wars are not just fought with guns and bombs. They are fought with understanding, with knowledge, with the ability to see beyond military objectives and into the hearts and minds of the people caught in the conflict. Time and time again, nations have gone to war believing that force alone will determine victory, that firepower can bend resistance, that occupation can erase identity. But history has shown relentlessly and painfully that wars waged without an understanding of the people being fought are wars destined to fail. Vietnam was not simply a battlefield. It was a country with centuries of history, a people who had repelled invaders long before America arrived, a nation that understood survival in ways Washington never could. The US fought battles but never won control, because control was never about the number of troops deployed, the bombs dropped, or the strategies executed. It was about the will of a people who refused to be conquered. And decades later, Iraq and Afghanistan would reveal the same lesson. Nations were entered without fully comprehending their histories, their cultures, their grievances. Victory was promised, yet stability was never secured. Governments were installed, yet legitimacy was never achieved. The enemy was targeted, yet insurgencies only grew stronger. Wars fought blindly, without reckoning with the realities of the land and its people, do not end. They only collapse, dragging nations into years of bloodshed before forcing them into inevitable retreat. The ghosts of these wars never fade, because the mistakes of these wars are never fully acknowledged. And so history repeats, a cycle of intervention and withdrawal, of conflicts begun under illusions and abandoned in reality. This narration has aimed to stay grounded in historical events and known facts, but as always, history is complex and perspectives may differ. If there are inaccuracies, they are unintentional. History is vast, and even the deepest research cannot capture every nuance. Now, put everything aside. Let the past settle. Let the weight of history drift into silence. Close your eyes. Breathe in deeply and let go of the noise. Sleep is waiting, and in its quiet embrace, there is peace.